Hello, my dear friends. An empire that once ruled the world, but saw sex as a tool to dominate, torture, and demonstrate power. From emperors who kept male prostitutes as decorations, to festivals where women were whipped to increase fertility, nothing was off limits. The scenes you're about to hear are not imaginary erotica, but real history carved on walls, painted on plates, and recorded in official documents. Tonight, you will join me in exploring the most naked truths that the ancient Roman Empire left behind. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background. And let's embark on this journey together tonight. If we begin with the idea that sex was a personal matter in ancient Rome, we're already off track. It wasn't private, it wasn't emotional, and it certainly wasn't equal. In the Roman world, sex was never just about pleasure, it was about hierarchy. Who had power over whom? Who penetrated, and who was penetrated. That dynamic alone told you everything you needed to know about a man's status. Sex was a language, a code of dominance, and everyone was expected to speak it fluently. For Roman men, especially those born free and high-ranking, sexual authority was just another extension of political and social control. They could take what they wanted from those beneath them, and that included bodies. A master could sleep with his male slaves, his female slaves, or even boys from defeated enemy territories, without shame. The issue wasn't whether the act was violent or unwanted, it was whether the man retained the dominant position. That was the only part that mattered. In other words, the Roman definition of manhood rested on conquest, not consent. They didn't separate sex from power, they saw them as one and the same. A Roman senator could command legions and still feel insecure if someone accused him of enjoying the wrong role in bed. That fear wasn't irrational in their society. The only real disgrace was being seen as the one who submitted. Even with a slave, even with someone powerless, if the roles were reversed, the shame stuck. What this meant was that sex wasn't something you enjoyed quietly. It was something you performed, and others watched. They listened. They gossiped. They judged. A man's worth could rise or fall depending on who he was seen with or how he was rumored to behave in private. And since sex was rarely private, the risk was constant. Your rivals might send someone to spy, or worse, invent stories that others would be eager to believe. Once your reputation had a crack, it didn't take long for the whole image to shatter. This is why Roman men obsessed over control, not just of others, but of themselves. Their posture, their expressions, even the way they spoke had to project certainty. Softness was dangerous. Hesitation could be mistaken for weakness. And weakness, in Rome, was unforgivable. Especially when it came to sex. They didn't fear the act. They feared being seen as the one without power. Public displays of dominance weren't limited to politics or military triumphs. They extended into the home, the banquet, the bathhouse. A man surrounded himself with people he could command and bodies he could possess. The more he was seen asserting himself, the more others respected his masculinity. But it wasn't just about action, it was about perception. He didn't need to do anything in public. The assumption that he was the one in charge was enough to sustain his image. The tragedy is that so much of it was theatre. People acted out roles. They said what was expected. They kept quiet when they saw something that might challenge the dominant view. A man who preferred tenderness had to fake aggression. A man who felt uncomfortable had to laugh at crude jokes. And no one dared admit vulnerability. Because in Rome, to admit weakness in sex was to surrender your place in the hierarchy. And once you slipped, there was no climbing back. It went even deeper than that. These rules applied not only to who you slept with, but also how you related to your family. A father was expected to keep strict control over his household. That included the sexual behavior of his wife, his daughters, and his slaves. If a woman in his house was rumored to be promiscuous, it wasn't just her reputation that suffered. His honor was questioned. People wondered if he had lost his grip, if he had failed to dominate what was his. The male body in Rome was not just a tool of war, but a weapon of control. To be admired, it had to be disciplined. To be feared, it had to appear untouchable. And to be respected, it had to dominate. Even in moments of intimacy, a Roman man was still expected to act like commander. Passion was allowed. Submission was not. The contrast between the two shaped everything from personal relationships to imperial propaganda. Statues of Roman leaders often showed them half naked, muscular, and firm. Not to arouse, but to assert. Their bodies were symbols of order, just like their military banners or their laws. And yet, those same bodies were always under scrutiny. One whispered accusation, one scrawl on a wall, and their strength could become the object of ridicule because no amount of muscle could save a man whose bedroom conduct was called into question. The double standard was clear. Women were not judged by whether they dominated or submitted. They were judged by who they belonged to. A woman's sexuality was not hers. It was a reflection of her male guardian status. If she misbehaved, it meant he had failed. But for men, their own bodies were the battlefield. They had to dominate constantly or face consequences that no battlefield loss could compare with. So when we speak of Roman sexuality, we're not just talking about preferences or habits. We're talking about a structure of power so rigid, so deeply embedded, that even a smile could be misinterpreted, even a sigh could be dangerous, and every interaction was a performance with real stakes. That is what made Roman sex politics more brutal than any law code. It wasn't enforced by soldiers, it was enforced by everyone around you. Sex was not something that happened behind closed doors. It walked into the forum with you. It sat with you at dinner. It followed you into the Senate. The pressure to appear dominant never lifted, and those who slipped were remembered not for what they achieved, but for what people believed they allowed. That's how gossip worked. It stuck harder than history. There was no neutral ground. You either dominated or you were mocked. You either acted the part or you were left behind. In Rome, being a man meant winning even in places where no one claimed to be keeping score. And losing that image could end everything. No title, no statue, no victory could erase what others whispered about your body. That obsession shaped every law, every custom, every fear. It wasn't morality, it was survival. And that survival depended not just on who you conquered in war, but who you conquered in bed, or who people thought you did. Next, we'll see what happened when that fragile performance failed. A scandal that touched the most powerful man in Rome. A whisper that never stopped echoing. His name was Julius Caesar, and the story is just beginning. That fragile image of dominance, which Roman men worked so hard to preserve, came with a safety net built into their society: slavery. Because while Roman law and custom judged a man harshly if he appeared submissive, it gave him nearly unlimited freedom when it came to people below him, and no one was lower in the social order than a slave. A Roman citizen could engage in all the sexual activity he wanted with a slave, and not a single eyebrow would be raised, not by law, not by religion, not even by gossip. There was no shame in it because, in their logic, a slave wasn't a real person in the way a citizen was. Slaves were seen as property, and using one sexually wasn't considered adultery. A man's loyalty to his wife was measured not by his behavior, but by whether he kept other free-born women out of his bed. A slave did not count. That exception created a loophole wide enough to hide entire brothels inside it, and it wasn't just men using female slaves. The same principle applied to male slaves too. Imagine if today's marriage vows included a clause that said, unless it's with someone who legally counts as furniture. That's how detached Roman ethics were from ideas of mutual consent or emotional fidelity. The body of a slave was a sanctioned outlet. It didn't provoke jealousy, didn't require explanation, and didn't challenge the man's honor. It was expected, even encouraged, as a part of managing the household. These arrangements weren't discreet. They didn't have to be. A rich Roman home might have included several young boys and girls chosen not just for labor, but for sexual service. Their presence was obvious. Their function was understood. There were no whispered scandals or secret rendezvous. Their masters claimed them openly, sometimes assigning them nicknames that joked about their duties. And this wasn't a rare exception. It was common practice across villas, apartments, and even military camps. To the Romans, a man was only guilty of infidelity if he involved a free woman or a married citizen's wife. That was the line. Everything beneath that line was permitted, and as strange as it sounds now, no one worried about the morality of it. The concern was always status, protecting family honor. And family honor had nothing to do with how you treated people who lacked legal standing. This setup allowed Roman men to live with constant contradiction. They could promote virtue in public speeches while exploiting half their household at home. They could campaign on the value of discipline while keeping a favorite slave boy in their private quarters. It wasn't hypocrisy by Roman standards. It was simply how things worked. The system was built to protect men's reputations while giving them unrestricted access to bodies considered unworthy of defense. Women didn't get this freedom. Their sexuality was guarded, monitored, and restricted, even inside marriage. A Roman woman accused of being with a slave could face severe consequences. Not just social exile, but legal punishment too. She could be disowned by her father, divorced by her husband, or even executed if her family chose to treat it as a matter of grave dishonor. In contrast, if her husband took a teenage slave into his bed, she was expected to ignore it. Her silence was a form of loyalty. What's disturbing is not just the double standard, but how comfortable everyone was with it. There was no pushback, no legal reform, no recorded protests. Slaves were used in this way for generations, and the practice was passed down like any other household skill. Mothers might even teach daughters how to avoid becoming jealous, how to endure the presence of concubines without complaint. It was seen as part of being a Roman wife. The use of slaves for sex wasn't just allowed, it was institutionalized. Even in military settings, commanders were given young attendants for personal use. In the writings of Roman historians, such arrangements are described with clinical normalcy. These accounts don't hide or dramatize the relationships. They mention them as plainly as one might list dinner guests. And again, the point was not emotional connection, it was ownership. Some inscriptions and poems joke about these relationships. Some are cruel, some are mocking, but almost no one questions the morality of what was happening. The concern was always whether a man was acting too fond, too soft, too attached. Those were the real dangers, not the use of another human being, but the perception that you had forgotten your place as master. A Roman could sleep with a dozen slaves and still be admired. But if he showed too much affection to one, his peers might start talking. This system blurred the lines between private desire and public power. A man's household was a mirror of his rank. The more control he displayed, the more respect he earned. A wife who obeyed, slaves who submitted, and children who mirrored his values all reinforced his standing. Sex was folded into this structure. It wasn't questioned, because it wasn't separate. It was another form of command. It's tempting to assume that all men use their slaves this way, but that wasn't necessarily true. Some may have abstained, some may have felt discomfort, but refusing this kind of dominance came with a price. If a man did not assert his rights, others might assume he lacked the strength to do so. In a world so obsessed with hierarchy, even mercy could look like weakness. Silence could invite suspicion, and restraint could be seen as rebellion against your status. Slaves, of course, had no say. They could not legally refuse. There was no concept of rape when it involved a slave. Consent was irrelevant. Some may have tried to resist, but the consequences were brutal. Others may have tried to survive by becoming favorites, trading physical access for better treatment. But that didn't make it a choice. It made it a survival strategy. The normalization of this behavior left a deep scar in Roman culture. It infected literature, family life, and even religion. Gods were often imagined in stories that mirrored the actions of elite men. Jupiter himself was portrayed as a sexual conqueror, taking what he wanted, when he wanted. These myths didn't challenge power. They justified it. They reinforced the idea that domination was divine and submission was natural. Looking at it now, it's hard to ignore how thoroughly Rome tied sex to control. Nothing was sacred. Nothing was truly private. And the cruelty wasn't in hidden corners. It was at the center of how society operated. What shocks us today is the structure they call order. Next, we'll look at how Rome institutionalized that order even further, creating entire neighborhoods, registries, and tax codes for a practice they saw as perfectly normal prostitution. But not all prostitutes were created equal, and in Rome, the difference between shame and celebration could come down to one coin and a public stage. If the sexual use of slaves helped men maintain control in private, Rome had another system to help manage desire in public. It was prostitution. But unlike in many other ancient cultures, where it remained unofficial or hidden, the Roman Empire didn't just tolerate prostitution. It structured it, regulated it, and taxed it. The business of selling sex became part of Rome's economy, its neighborhoods, and even its festivals. And once again, the purpose was never pleasure. It was control. Sex for sale wasn't treated as a shameful back-alley secret. It was written into the laws. Prostitutes were required to register with local authorities. Their names, their services, even their fees could be listed in ledgers. The state didn't protect them from harm, but it made sure to take a portion of their earnings. They were both ignored and used. Their labor was seen as necessary, but their dignity was erased in the process. Imagine a world where the government gives you a license to be used, but never a shield to feel safe. That was Rome. There were no health checks, no rights, no protections, only taxes and expectations. And while prostitution was legal, it came with a permanent social stain. A registered prostitute could never marry a freeborn citizen. Her children were excluded from respectable inheritance. And even if she left the trade, the legal mark remained on her record. But within that world, there was structure, a hierarchy. Not all prostitutes were equal. Some worked in dark alley stalls called cubicular behind taverns. Others were attached to brothels controlled by powerful men. And a few operated independently, charging more and choosing their clients. There were streetwalkers, bathhouse workers, party girls, and performers. Some were slaves forced into it. Others were free women driven by poverty or circumstance. The lines between choice and coercion were always blurred. Roman cities had entire districts known for prostitution. These weren't slums hidden on the outskirts. They were woven into the city, near temples, along marketplaces, close to military barracks. Some streets even got their names from the services offered there. At night, oil lamps marked the entrances, and clients didn't have to guess. Lists of services and prices were sometimes scratched into the walls. Even the graffiti joined in, mocking or praising certain workers by name. Some brothels were plain stone rooms with nothing but a cot and a wall carving. Others catered to wealthier men, with paintings, cushions, and wine. The decor didn't hide the function. It advertised it. Frescoes on the walls depicted graphic scenes, offering previews like a menu, and the more upscale the place, the more exotic the theme. Egyptian motifs, Greek myths, wild animals. It wasn't about art, it was about fantasy. The irony was that the elite men who denounced public vulgarity often spent their nights paying for the same. Senators visited brothels, sometimes in disguise, sometimes proudly. Some even hosted their events, hiring groups of prostitutes for private feasts. These weren't quiet affairs. They were spectacles, dances, music, flowing wine, and staged sex acts. In some circles, hosting an outrageous party was seen as a sign of wealth and sophistication. The women at these events were often chosen for their novelty. Some were known for their singing, others for their flexibility or unusual talents. They weren't called by their real names. They had stage names, short nicknames, or simply labels. They were commodities, passed around, evaluated, praised or dismissed. And though they stood at the center of attention, they held no real power. In literature, these women appear often, sometimes as temptresses, other times as punchlines. Poets wrote verses comparing their bodies to temples or storms, but never as people. They were metaphors, not individuals. The public could admire their beauty while scorning their profession. A man might boast of sleeping with a famous courtesan, but never marry her. Her status remained fixed, no matter her fame. Even the gods seemed to allow it. Venus, the goddess of love, had temples where some rituals resembled commercial sex. Certain festivals encouraged loosened morals. During Saturnalia, slaves and masters swapped roles, and sexual behavior became theatrical. In those moments, prostitutes were no longer invisible. They were center stage, but as soon as the celebration ended, they returned to their corners, used and then discarded again. The legal codes reinforced their status. If a prostitute was assaulted, the penalties were lighter than if it happened to a citizen woman. If she became pregnant, her child was automatically excluded from citizenship unless the father was known and approved. And if she tried to leave the profession and marry up, the law blocked her. Once registered, always marked. Rome's tolerance of sex work was never about respect. It was about boundaries. And yet, within that system, some women found ways to rise. A few became so well known that their names appeared in poetry and plays. They attracted wealthy clients, amassed property, and even sponsored events. But even then, their ceiling was low. No matter how clever or rich they became, they could never cross the final line. They could entertain the ruling class, but they could never join it. Looking at Rome's approach to prostitution, what stands out most is how organized the exploitation was. There was no pretense, no moral justification, just structure. It was a machine, and every part of it fed the power of men. The women were necessary but disposable, celebrated but never safe, and their existence helped reinforce the idea that power meant access, that control over bodies was the natural right of those who ruled. What shocks us is not that prostitution existed, it's that it was turned into policy, that it was tracked, taxed, and mapped like any other civic duty. Rome didn't hide this part of itself. It embraced it, wove it into architecture, law, and daily life. And for Roman men, paying for sex was not a vice. It was a privilege. Next, we'll go deeper into that privilege, to a holiday where rules vanished, whips replaced flowers, and sex became a sacred ritual. A celebration so chaotic, it made the gods blush. Welcome to the Lupercalia. If Rome could turn sex into law, it could just as easily turn it into religion. And few festivals captured that strange blend of faith and flesh better than Lupercalia. Every year, in the middle of February, the city lets go of its usual constraints. Rules were relaxed, roles were reversed, and beneath the surface of celebration, something far more primal was on display. This wasn't just a party. It was a ritual with centuries of tradition, animal blood, and public nudity. The Romans called it sacred. Outsiders would have called it chaos. The event began with priests, known as Luperci, sacrificing goats and a dog in the Lupercal cave, the legendary birthplace of Rome's founders, Romulus and Remus. From the skins of those animals, they cut thin leather strips called februa. Then, almost immediately, the real spectacle started. The priests, naked or nearly so, ran through the streets of the Palatine Hill, lashing women gently with the strips, and the women did not run away. They lined up willingly, because in the Roman mind, being struck by goat-hide whips was believed to boost fertility and ease childbirth. Nothing says romance like getting hit with freshly skinned goat leather in the name of divine approval. But this wasn't treated as strange. It was celebrated. The crowd cheered. Wine flowed freely. The laughter was loud, and the rules of modesty were suspended for a day. Even high-born women, normally cloaked in layers of silk and protocol, would take part. Getting whipped by a Lupercus was a lucky charm, not an embarrassment. The atmosphere was unlike anything else in the Roman calendar. There were no formal speeches, no carefully choreographed processions, just a wave of bodies, sweat, wine, and tradition moving through the city like a living current. The line between priest and reveller blurred quickly, and that was the point. The sacred wasn't supposed to feel clean or orderly, it was meant to be raw. The Romans believed that the body could be a vessel for divine force, especially when stirred by fear, pleasure, or pain. The connection to sex was never directly spoken, but always understood. Lupercalia honored fertility in all its forms. Women were blessed through lashes. Men proved their virility by running, shouting, and showing themselves without shame. And behind the rituals, parties took shape. Small gatherings turned into drinking contests. Private corners turned into public displays. The energy didn't return to normal when the sun went down. It only grew. The government, far from banning the event, supported it, even as Rome became more structured, more bureaucratic. Lupercalia remained untouchable for centuries. It was a cultural pressure valve, a time to indulge impulses that were normally hidden, and because it was framed as a religious rite, almost nothing was off limits. If a senator joined in the whipping, people laughed. If a general got drunk and kissed a stranger in public, it became a story, not a scandal. The deeper reason this festival lasted so long was its mythological weight. It was rooted in the origin story of Rome itself. The wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus symbolized wildness, instinct, and survival. Lupercalia was a tribute to that wolf spirit, to the idea that civilization needed moments of release. And if that release looked like a frenzy of half-naked men chasing women with goat-skin lashes, so be it. It's hard not to notice that the same culture that preached order and virtue made space for a yearly riot in the name of the gods. Roman discipline was always balanced by Roman indulgence. Their leaders spoke of restraint while secretly funding the chaos. The contradiction wasn't hidden, it was embraced. One day of madness helped preserve 12 months of control. That was the logic. And yet, as the empire shifted, so did its tolerance for older pagan customs. By the time Christianity spread through the ruling class, Lupercalia began to feel less like religion and more like heresy. Church leaders condemned it. They saw the nakedness, the drunkenness, the sexual energy, and labeled it a danger to Christian morality. There were efforts to reinterpret the festival, to replace it with saints and symbols, but old habits die hard. The last documented Lupercalia took place in the late 5th century, under the rule of Pope Gelasius III. He denounced the practice as indecent and unfit for a Christian city, and though some Romans resisted, the tide had turned. 1,000 years of tradition ended not with a riot, but with a decree. Whips were hung up, temples were repurposed, and the wild energy that once pulsed through the city every February was folded into something tamer. What remained was memory, and some believe echoes of Lupercalia lived on in later customs. Valentine's Day, with its arrows, hearts, and rituals of courtship, has been loosely linked to the older festival, but whatever resemblance exists is pale compared to the original. The real Lupercalia was not about cards or chocolates. It was about fertility, violence, and a thin veil between human and beast. It also revealed something uncomfortable about Roman values, that even religion, The thing most societies used to restrain passion was used to unleash it here. The gods didn't demand piety. They demanded proof of strength, of virility, of courage to step outside normal roles. Lupercalia gave Roman men the stage to perform that proof, and women, willingly or not, played their part too. What makes it unsettling is how joyfully it was done. There was no fear, no guilt, only cheers and celebration. In the streets of the greatest empire, people proved their devotion not through silence and prayer, but through flesh and noise. They believed this pleased the divine. And maybe, for a while, it did. But as Rome changed, a festival survival became impossible. A new god now ruled the empire. One who demanded humility over spectacle, modesty over excess. And in that world, Lupercalia no longer had a place. Next, we'll turn from public rituals to private chambers, where what started as a toast could end in a room full of bodies. Roman banquets were never just about food. They were feasts of power, pride, and pleasure. And the more elite the guest list, the more decadent the night became. Lupercalia may have disappeared from the calendar, but its spirit never fully left Roman culture. If the street no longer allowed for public rituals of excess, the private homes stepped in to replace it. And in no setting was that more visible than in the elite Roman banquet. These gatherings started with food and flattery, but rarely ended there. For the ruling class, a dinner party was not just about hospitality, it was a performance, an opportunity to display wealth, status, and sexual access all in one luxurious evening. The guests were chosen carefully, powerful men, rising politicians, artists, poets, and sometimes their mistresses or favorites. The atmosphere grew looser with every cup of wine. At first, the discussion stayed political or philosophical, but the later the hour, the more personal everything became. Jokes sharpened, hands wandered, bodies shifted closer. The servants knew the signs. They dimmed the lights, poured stronger wine, and made space for what came next. A Roman banquet without sex was like a theatre with no actors, empty, strange, and missing the point. These evenings often ended in collective acts that blur the lines between host and guest, pleasure and power. Slaves were expected to join in. Prostitutes were brought in ahead of time, waiting in the side rooms or even already present at the table. Gender didn't matter, neither did age, as long as everyone played their part in the host's performance of indulgence. There were no rules except one the host had to be in control. These weren't orgies in the modern sense of mutual abandon. They were carefully choreographed spectacles where hierarchy stayed intact. The host initiated. The guests followed. Those who hesitated risked seeming uptight or, worse, disloyal. A guest who withdrew too early might find himself excluded from future gatherings. And in Rome, losing access to these circles could mean losing everything. For the slaves and prostitutes, it was simply another part of their labor. They were passed between guests without pause. Some were praised for their beauty or skill. Others were laughed at, discarded, and called back later if someone changed their mind. There was no privacy, no dignity, only the rhythm of pleasure and display. What mattered was the mood, the pace, the sense that something extraordinary, something Roman, was happening. These banquets often included musicians, poets, and dancers. But eventually, the entertainment turned physical. It became a challenge. Who could last the longest? Who could shock the room? Who could seduce the most partners in one night? Stories of legendary parties circulated for years. Senators who boasted of bedding 3 slaves in a row. Generals who laughed as they shared concubines with their subordinates. These weren't secrets. They were trophies. It's disturbing how often the line between celebration and exploitation was not just crossed but erased entirely. There was no consideration of consent from the lower classes. Their presence was assumed, their participation was mandatory, and their pain, if noticed, was treated as part of the experience. A powerful man could laugh about breaking a wine cup in bed but never mention the bruises on the boy beneath him. The structure of these events was mirrored in Roman values. Excess was not a flaw. It was a sign of achievement. To host a dull banquet was a social sin. To host a memorable one, even if it ended in chaos, secured your reputation. Men competed for influence through these displays, and women, if present, often played decorative roles or participated to elevate their husband's standing. Some parties were themed: Greek nights with togas and lyres, Egyptian feasts with dancers in golden masks, mythical reenactments where guests acted out scenes of seduction and conquest. The more creative the host, the more memorable the night. But beneath the costumes and music, the same principle remained: power expressed through appetite. Appetite is measured by how much you can consume and command. These events became so legendary that some philosophers condemned them. Seneca wrote about the corruption of Roman youth, blaming the banquet halls more than the battlefields. Others described the evenings with reluctant awe, acknowledging the brilliance of the host even as they cringed at the aftermath. But rarely did anyone speak for the ones used. Their names didn't survive, only their function. For those who lived to serve at these tables, the nights bled into each other. Pleasure for some meant exhaustion for others. There are records of slaves collapsing from overwork, of women crying silently in corners while laughter roared around them. But no law stopped it. No authority stepped in. It was, after all, private property. And in Rome, a man's home was his empire. What fascinates now is how normalized it was. These weren't secret gatherings in shadowy villas. They were part of elite social life. Children born from these evenings were sometimes raised openly. Others were discarded or sent away. But the banquets continued, year after year, generation after generation, as if the empire itself depended on proving that no desire was too great and no limit too sacred. It's hard not to feel that Roman pride was built as much on cruelty as it was on conquest. They conquered lands and people, but also bodies and silence, and they celebrated that conquest not just with statues and victories, but with long nights where nothing was off limits and no one was safe. Next, we leave the banquet hall and enter the walls of their homes and bathhouses, where even the architecture tells a story. Because in Rome, sex wasn't hidden in bedrooms. It was carved into the walls, painted beside the bed, and worshipped in temples. Welcome to the art of domination. If Roman banquets were places to act out sexual power, Roman walls were places to display it. You didn't need to attend a feast to know what Rome valued. You only had to look around. The erotic wasn't hidden in secret corners. It was carved into columns, painted across bedrooms, and scratched onto public walls. The city was a gallery of desire. But more than that, it was a gallery of control, dominance, and everything that lay beneath the surface of a Roman discipline. Walk through the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, and the first thing you'll notice is how unshy the art is. Bedrooms with paintings of couples in every position, hallways with frescoes of group sex, even bakeries and taverns featured carvings of large erect penises surrounded by symbols of luck. These weren't jokes, they were reminders. Power was measured not only in money or weapons, but also in virility. The male body, always erect, always victorious, was everywhere. In Rome, even the kitchen wall might cheer you on with a giant stone phallus and a wink. Public toilets had erotic graffiti, bathhouses had ceiling frescoes showing scenes of sexual conquest, and homes, no matter how elegant, often included art that would make today's museums hesitate. It was not considered scandalous, it was considered Roman. The phallus was especially sacred. Called the fascinum, it wasn't just decoration, it was protection. Romans believed that images of the penis could ward off evil. They placed them above doorways, in children's rooms, even around their necks as charms. Some were small and discreet, others were bold, with wings or eyes or even legs. The message was clear. Sexual power wasn't shameful, It was magical, holy, even. But the imagery wasn't just limited to heterosexual scenes. Roman art included same-sex couples, both male and female, often portrayed in acts that reinforced the idea of hierarchy. The dominant partner was idealized, a passive one often stylized as lower in status. Group sex was also common in wall art, especially in brothels, where the images acted as both menu and instruction. What today would be considered pornography was, for them, a kind of cultural wallpaper. Some of the most detailed erotic art has been found in the suburban villas of the wealthy. These weren't public taverns, they were private retreats, and still, the walls were filled with scenes that mixed mythology and sex, Zeus seducing mortals, satyrs chasing nymphs, gods transforming into animals to fulfill their desires. These stories were known by everyone. They justified human behavior by pointing to the divine. If Jupiter could cheat, so could you. Children were not shielded from these images. They grew up surrounded by them. It wasn't unusual for a boy to learn the alphabet by reading graffiti on a wall that also described someone's latest bedroom conquest. There were no censorship laws, no separation between art and anatomy, and while the elite might pretend to be cultured in their interpretations, the purpose of the images was often as physical as the acts they showed. What's incredible is how much of it survived. Even after volcanic ash buried entire cities, the walls kept speaking. Excavations in the 18th and 19th centuries uncovered hundreds of erotic frescoes, many of which were quickly hidden away. Museums called them obscene and locked them in restricted archives. Scholars debated whether Rome had been depraved, but to the Romans themselves, this art was just part of the furniture. They didn't use curtains to hide their pleasures. They used statues to honor them, penises carved into milestones, into household shrines, even into the handles of oil lamps. One popular motif showed Mercury, the god of commerce, alongside a phallus, as if reminding merchants that success required more than gold. Another common figure was Priapus, a rustic god always depicted with an impossibly large erection, guarding gardens like a fertility scarecrow. The temples were no different. In places where people came to worship, images of sex were painted on the ceiling. Some shrines offered figurines or clay tablets showing lovers in explicit positions, asking the gods for passion, fertility, or domination. Even in death, the imagery remained. Tombs carried inscriptions with sexual puns or references to former conquests. A man might be remembered not for kindness, but for stamina. This culture of visual sexuality wasn't without critics. Philosophers like Cicero and Seneca occasionally questioned the morality of public eroticism, but their voices were outnumbered. Most Romans, even those in high office, saw no contradiction between power and pleasure. A general might kneel at a temple one day and host an erotic poetry contest the next. It was all part of a balanced life. The deeper message of these images was not about lust, it was about hierarchy. The art reinforced who should be in charge, who should submit, who deserved pleasure, and who was meant to provide it. Even when the scene was playful or mythical, the roles were clear. Roman sexuality, even in paint, was a mirror of Roman society. What makes it unsettling is how normal it all was. No one flinched, no one whispered. They laughed, pointed, and sometimes added their own drawings beside the originals. The walls didn't need ears, they had mouths, and they repeated the same message again and again: dominance is beauty, submission is forgettable. Next, we'll go deeper into that message, not through paint or stone, but through the tools Romans left behind. Because if the walls could talk, the objects in their drawers could whisper something even stranger. From carved dildos to scented oils, from bronze mirrors to locked belts, the Roman appetite for control extended even to the instruments they used in bed. Let's open the drawer. The walls of Roman homes made their pleasures visible, but the drawers, the boxes, the private corners of those same homes told an even more intimate story. While painting showed what Romans believed about sex, the objects they used showed how they practiced it. Their appetite was not limited to partners, it extended to tools, devices crafted from wood, leather, and metal, some ordinary in form, others strange, all of them designed to stimulate, to dominate, or to entertain. These weren't accidents of history. They were built with purpose, and in Rome, that purpose was never questioned. Dildos, for example, have been unearthed in villas and bathhouses, stored carefully like any other household item. Some were carved from wood, others shaped in bronze. A few were covered in leather. Their size and shape varied, but the intention behind them was clear. They weren't religious, they weren't artistic, they were meant for use, and they weren't hidden. Their presence didn't cause a scandal. Instead, they reflected a world where sexual curiosity had physical outlets. It's one thing to imagine Roman indulgence, another to find the instruments still waiting where they were last left. These weren't symbolic relics. They had worn. They had design details meant to make them more effective. Some even included rings for grip or attachments to be worn. Their existence suggests not just openness, but experimentation. Pleasure wasn't passive, it was engineered. Lubricants were common too. Romans had no shortage of ingredients. Olive oil was the most widely used, found in nearly every household and in nearly every kind of intimacy. But for more refined experiences, they turned to honey, animal fat, and scented ointments. Recipes were passed down in herbal manuals. Some included ingredients meant to arouse, to numb, or to perfume. These weren't secret recipes. They were shared like any beauty routine or health tip. These substances weren't limited to bedroom use. In brothels, attendants applied oil before and after encounters, often warming it beforehand. The scent became part of the experience, sweet or musky, depending on the mixture. In wealthier homes, slaves kept small jars ready near beds or in bathing areas. They were as essential as wine, as familiar as incense, and once again, their presence didn't cause discomfort. They were as Roman as sandals. But the tools went beyond handheld objects. The Romans built furniture with sex in mind. Some chairs were designed to support unusual positions. Others had hand grips or adjustable angles. Beds in brothels were often set into stone, a mattress added on top. Some included shallow basins underneath, which are easy to clean. Even household couches, where guests might recline during a feast, could be repurposed when the night turned physical. The lines between rest and indulgence blurred easily. Imagine IKEA releasing a line called Domus Erotica and no one batting an eye. That's what Rome was. Furniture that served pleasure wasn't taboo. It was practical. If a man could afford a better chariot or a better sword, why not a better bed for his tastes? The logic was consistent. Comfort and conquest were always close. There's evidence of harnesses too, leather straps, bronze buckles, sometimes attached to walls or bedposts. Scholars debate their exact use, but the most likely explanation involves restraint, not as punishment, but as stimulation. For Romans, control over the body was a mark of authority. Being able to bind another, physically or socially, was part of their identity. The same hands that signed decrees might tie a knot just as carefully. Some temples even featured statues holding or standing beside these kinds of objects. Priapus, the rustic fertility god, was often shown with exaggerated anatomy, leaning against a post or balancing a scale. In some regions, small wooden dildos were offered as votive gifts. A prayer for fertility, pleasure, or the healing of sexual dysfunction. Religion didn't hide these things, it absorbed them. Even traveling Romans brought their tools. Portable kits, found in military camps and merchant homes, included miniature oils, small phallic charms, and sometimes collapsible accessories, just like grooming sets or coin purses. These items reflected daily life. The boundary between utility and intimacy was thin. To us, They seem like artifacts. To them, they were conveniences. The presence of these tools across all classes tells us that this wasn't just elite behavior. Market stalls sold cheaper versions. Some were made from clay or bone, easier to produce but less durable. There are graffiti references to customers buying used items, or artisans advertising their latest designs. Even the blacksmith could double as a craftsman of pleasure, shaping both blades and bedroom objects without changing the furnace. What's notable is how little judgment appears in the historical record. Satirists joked about size or performance, but rarely about the use of tools themselves. The critique, when it came, was directed at overuse or vanity. A man who depended too much on aids might be mocked for softness, but the tools weren't questioned. Their existence was proof of Roman values, practical, direct, and willing to shape desire like any other aspect of life. What shocks modern audiences is not the tools themselves, but how ordinary they were in Roman hands. They weren't locked away. They were laid out, cared for, replaced when worn. The culture didn't treat sexual desire as something dangerous to manage, but as something to be refined, like taste or conversation. Of course, the freedom to use these tools was not shared equally. As always, slaves had no voice in how they were used. Women had less room to explore without consequence. And those at the bottom of society might use tools for others' pleasure but never their own. Just because Rome built the devices didn't mean it gave everyone the right to enjoy them. Still, these objects survived. In museum drawers and archaeological sites, they sit quietly, holding the fingerprints of a culture that took physical desire seriously. Not in secret, not with shame, but with wood, oil, and iron. Next, we turn from tools to the ones who used them most visibly, not in bedrooms or temples, but in open markets and alleys. Because in Rome, not all lovers were free, and the most visible figures of Roman sexuality were often the most vulnerable. The boys kept as favorites by powerful men. The tools of pleasure told one story. The people they used told another. In Rome, objects could be owned, but so could bodies. And in the higher circles of society, ownership was not just about labor. It extended into intimacy. Roman elites did not just collect statues or chariots. Some of them collected boys, carefully selected, closely watched, and completely controlled. These young companions served as living symbols of luxury and dominance. Their role was unspoken but understood. They were not adopted. They were not sons. They were for pleasure, known as delicia, meaning delights. These boys were often brought into elite homes as ornaments of indulgence. They came from conquered lands, slave markets, or poor Roman families who sold their children out of desperation. The wealthier the patron, the more exquisite the boy. He was trained not only in behavior but in presentation. Hair curled, skin softened, body kept lean and youthful. In essence, he was turned into a decorative object that also happened to breathe. These boys were not hidden. They accompanied their patrons to banquets, rode with them in litters, and sometimes slept on cushions beside their feet during meetings. Their presence did not provoke outrage. It enhanced the status of the man who owned them. The ability to maintain such a companion required wealth, discretion, and a reputation strong enough to deflect criticism. In public, the boys might pour wine or recite poetry. In private, their duties were more personal. Consent was never part of the arrangement. These boys had no voice in what they were expected to provide. Some were as young as 10, taken before they could understand their role. They were expected to please, to obey, and above all, to never challenge the man who owned them. If they showed reluctance, they could be beaten. If they aged out, they could be discarded. In every sense, they were possessions. Imagine living in a world where your body was polished like silver and displayed like furniture, and no one found that strange. That was the world of the delicia. Their silence was not only expected, it was part of their appeal. To speak too much, to express emotion, was considered disruptive. The ideal boy was beautiful, quiet, and pliable. And for Roman men, this kind of control was not immoral, it was admired. Some emperors made this practice shockingly public. Nero famously married a boy named Sporus, dressing him in women's clothes and calling him his wife. Later, he played the husband to another young man, alternating roles depending on the crowd. Elagabalus, another emperor, kept an entire household of young male lovers, rewarding them with titles and gifts. These actions raised eyebrows, but not because of the boys. The criticism came when the emperor appeared too emotionally attached or behaved too much like the passive partner. The line was always about dominance. A man could surround himself with boys as long as he remained the master. Any sign that he was too tender, too soft, or too invested made him vulnerable to mockery. Roman poets like Martial and Juvenal used this tension in their verses, mocking senators who cried over their favorites or spent more on perfume for a boy than on their household. But the ownership itself was never mocked. That part was normal. These relationships were often long-term but rarely stable. A favorite might rise in influence, receiving better clothes, better food, and even property. But the position was precarious. One mistake, one shift in mood, and the boy could be replaced. He might be sold, sent away, or even punished publicly to demonstrate the master's detachment. There was no protection, no promise, only the illusion of intimacy. The boys, in turn, learned to adapt. Some became expert manipulators, using their beauty to gain favors. Others retreated inward, surviving by obedience and silence. And a few, tragically, ended their lives before being discarded. The system was not built to care for them. It was built to showcase the power of those who could afford them. Roman society rarely questioned the ethics of these arrangements. Philosophers debated virtue, but few condemned the practice outright. It was simply one of many ways that wealth expressed itself. A man might show off his garden, his library, his exotic birds, and his favorite boy in the same evening. Guests were expected to admire the selection, not challenge its morality. What makes it even darker is how ordinary it became. These boys appeared in love poems, plays, and gossip. Their names were known, but not remembered. Their youth was praised, but their futures were ignored. When they disappeared, no one asked why. Someone younger always took their place. The physical objects from earlier, dildos, restraints, and oils, were often used on these boys, not with them. The tools of Roman pleasure were rarely shared. They were applied to the bodies that could not say no, and that is what made it Roman. The absence of mutuality, the presence of control, the celebration of power without consequence. Some later Christian writers would condemn the practice, but by then it had already left its mark on the empire. The art, the poetry, the laws, they all reflect a culture that measured men by how many things they could possess, including people. And in that list, the deliciae were just one more item, polished and placed like any other treasure. Next, we follow the logic of this control one step further. When the boundary of age disappeared, what else could in the streets of Rome? Children did not just witness adult behavior. They were pulled into it, sold, swapped, and used without shame. Because for Rome, power did not stop at the bedroom. It reached into the cradle. If Roman men could parade their boy companions in front of dinner guests without consequence, then it was no stretch for the empire to look past the boundaries of age entirely. The idea of a child being too young was not part of the Roman vocabulary. What mattered was whether they were useful, if they were quiet, obedient, and owned by someone else. Age became irrelevant. The younger the child, the less likely they are to resist. And in a world obsessed with dominance, that alone made them valuable. In Roman households, enslaved children were treated as tools, and the law did not require owners to consider their well-being. A child could be taken into the home to clean or serve, and just as easily expected to provide more intimate services. There were no age restrictions, no oversight, no protections. If the child were a slave, they could not refuse. If they were free but poor, their safety depended entirely on the generosity of those around them. It was a structure built for silence. In Rome, childhood was not a protected stage of life. It was just another rung on the ladder of control. A child could be bought, gifted, or inherited, and that transaction often included expectations that went far beyond labor. Masters who favored young attendants were not shamed. They were admired for their taste. Their status made their choices untouchable, and the children themselves had no voice in the matter. Some of these children became known by name, usually in passing comments by poets or guests. A boy who poured wine with the right posture, or who sang in a soft enough voice, might be remembered briefly, but most faded into obscurity. Their presence was expected, their obedience assumed, and their aging punished with dismissal. Many were replaced before they'd even grown into adolescence. Those who stayed longer often did so because they pleased their masters in ways that extended beyond service. Girls were rarely treated any better. Young girls born into slavery could be placed in brothels before their bodies were fully formed. Customers paid more for those described as untouched, and Roman brothel records reflect a grim fascination with youth. Some girls were given training in basic etiquette to serve wealthier clients. Others were kept in rougher establishments where their first encounters were brutal and fast. The law did not intervene. It simply taxed the establishment and kept a list of its earnings. In more elite homes, a girl might be kept as a concubine from childhood. She would live under the same roof as the wife, but serve a different role. If she became pregnant, the child would belong to the master, and the girl would be praised for her fertility. If she resisted or aged, she would be sold or assigned elsewhere. No one asked how she felt. That question didn't exist in the Roman structure. Usefulness was everything. Religious practices did not always offer shelter either. In some regions, fertility rites included young participants, especially girls chosen to symbolize purity or rebirth. These children were often expected to take part in symbolic marriages or intimate rituals, watched by the community and approved by tradition. Whether those rituals were spiritual or physical, the child's consent was never a consideration. The rite was older than the law, and in the Roman world, tradition carried weight. Writers from the time did not disguise these things. Some described the beauty of youthful limbs or the innocence of a trembling voice. Erotic poems made jokes about how young was too young. The satire targeted the aging patron who could not resist a boy of 10, but never questioned the system that made such a thing possible. The joke was always about taste, never about ethics. What disturbs us now is not just what happened, but how it was ignored. There were no reformers, no whistleblowers, no structure for justice. A child could be hurt, and no one would record it. The household would go on, the master's life would remain untouched, and the child would be replaced as if they had never existed. Those children who survived learned to adapt quickly. They smiled when expected. They stayed close but not too close. They understood silence as survival. Some gained small rewards like softer clothing or better food. Others were allowed to sleep indoors, but even those comforts were conditional. The power dynamic never changed. One wrong move, one sign of aging, and they were gone. A few philosophers hinted at discomfort. They wrote about moderation, about the importance of self-control. But even these voices were more concerned with how indulgence made a man look, not what it did to the person he used. There was no concept of psychological harm, no word for trauma. A child's pain did not carry forward. It stayed locked inside the walls where it began. Bathhouses were another space where children were exposed to risk. Young attendants scrubbed floors, carried towels, and sometimes received the wrong kind of attention. In the steam and laughter, age blurred. If a patron asked for more, the child could not refuse. The other patrons would look away, the owner would not interfere. In public spaces, the same rules applied. Power decided what was allowed, not principle. The silence in the historical record is not a sign that nothing happened. It is a sign that no one thought it mattered. These children were too small to write letters, too poor to commission statues, and too replaceable to be mourned. Their suffering was not erased. It was never written in the first place. Rome prided itself on order, discipline, and structure. It built aqueducts, roads, and forums that still stand. But under those stones were bodies that never had a say. Their names lost, their lives decided for them, their worth measured by how much they could endure without complaint. Next, we walk into the bathhouse itself, a place where the body was on full display, where privacy vanished in the steam, and where dominance played out as casually as conversation. In that heat, every touch had meaning, and the walls watched everything. After passing through the heavy silence of childhood exploitation, the Roman obsession with the body did not disappear. It simply stepped into the light. In the bustling bathhouses of Rome, nakedness was not hidden. It was expected. The bathhouse was the one place where class lines softened and fabrics vanished. Senators, merchants, slaves, and visitors could all enter the same steam-filled space, disrobe without shame, and submerge their bodies into water warmed by fires beneath the floor. In theory, these baths were places of cleansing. They had cold rooms, hot rooms, massage areas, and attendants offering oils and towels. But in practice, they became places of exposure. Not only physical exposure, but also social and sexual exposure. Once the tunic dropped, power dynamics changed. People watched one another. They noted scars, build, and grooming habits. Nudity was not neutral. It carried messages, especially in a society that read everything as a sign of status or submission. It was like attending a networking event where everyone was naked and pretending it was about health. Gossip moved through the steam faster than sound. Men compared themselves, not just in wealth or muscle, but in size and boldness. Some used the space to flaunt their youth, others their confidence. A few used it to seek company. The line between social gathering and sexual opportunity blurred in the condensation on the walls. Women were not excluded from this practice entirely. Or some baths were single-gender by schedule, others allowed overlap, especially in provincial towns or during festivals. Roman literature and graffiti often suggest that mixed bathing was more common than elite writers like to admit. For many women, it was a chance to assert confidence or flirtation. For others, it was a requirement of work, especially if they were masseuses, entertainers, or slaves assisting guests. To be a woman in a Roman bathhouse meant being observed. There was no such thing as privacy. Some women embraced the gaze, using jewelry or strategic oils to draw attention. Others simply endured it, understanding that refusing to bathe in public could raise suspicion. In Rome, too much modesty looked unnatural. A woman who hid her body was thought to be sick, ashamed, or rebellious, and rebellion was rarely forgiven. Not surprisingly, acts beyond bathing occurred. There are accounts and caricatures of couples slipping away into corners, of suggestive games in the steam, of hands wandering beneath the water surface. Some establishments became known for tolerating these behaviors. Others pretended not to notice. A man might enter for a soak and end up with more. A woman might accompany a patron and be expected to comply. No one kept records. No one asked questions. Bathhouses were the Roman version of a nightclub, a spa, and a gossip column rolled into one. They were places where reputations could be made or unmade. A chance meeting with a senator could lead to promotion. A casual comment could become tomorrow's scandal. Men discussed business while rubbing oil on one another's backs. Women watched from behind thin veils or towels, trying to maintain dignity in a space that encouraged curiosity. There was even a hierarchy among bathhouse staff: the oil boys, the towel carriers, the musicians, the prostitutes who lingered at the entrances, all played their roles. Some bathhouses had separate rooms for more private transactions. Others simply used the shadows between the columns. The boundaries were flexible. What mattered was who you were and how much you paid. That, more than morality, dictated what was acceptable. Public murals and statues inside these bathhouses reflected the same boldness. Erotic scenes painted above the pools, phallic symbols carved into benches, images of gods and mortals intertwined in suggestive positions. It was not pornography as we know it. It was a cultural expression of dominance, fertility, and beauty. Children saw it. Elders laughed at it. Visitors from outside Rome sometimes reacted with discomfort, but Romans themselves seemed immune to embarrassment. The empire's ability to normalize public nakedness was not without limits. Some conservative voices tried to speak against it. A few senators warned that mixed bathing weakened Roman values. Certain emperors issued decrees against women entering the baths at certain hours, but these rules were often ignored or quietly repealed. The demand for access and freedom within these spaces was too strong. The people had tasted a kind of openness and would not return to strict divisions. For all its openness, the bathhouse could still be dangerous not just for the weak or the young, but for those whose reputations depended on discretion. A single accusation of inappropriate behavior in the bath could spiral into full scandal. A slave might report a touch. A rival might spread rumors. And in a city where whispers carried more weight than law, even a naked encounter in a steamy room could destroy a career. The bathhouse was the perfect metaphor for Roman life. Everything exposed, nothing safe. You had to perform even in relaxation. How you walked across the wet tile, how you responded to a joke, how long you lingered in the hot pool. It all signaled something. People watched. They remembered. They told others. The bathhouse did not clean away sin. It revealed it. To a modern eye, it seemed strange that such a prudish culture and law could be so indulgent in public behavior. But Rome was full of contradictions. They punished adultery yet tolerated brothels. They praised virtue but painted erotic art. They feared moral decay yet flocked to festivals that celebrated excess. The bathhouse stood at the center of this confusion, a temple to the body and a stage for the ego. Looking back, it is easy to imagine these rooms as exotic or liberated. But for many, especially those without status, they were places of pressure and performance. To be seen was to be judged. To relax was to risk exposure. And behind every smile in the steam, there was calculation. Now, we descend even further into Rome's rituals of exposure, not just with bodies, but with belief. Where sex met religion, and where gods watched what mortals did with trembling approval. After the steamy haze of the Roman bathhouses, where bodies moved freely and rules seemed to blur, the city's obsession with sex did not pause behind closed doors. It found its way into scrolls, lyrics, and verses. In ancient Rome, eroticism did not just belong to the bed or the bath. It lived in ink. Roman poets, playwrights, and musicians made no effort to cloak their intentions. Sex was not just acted out, it was written, sung, and performed. This culture of literary openness served both to entertain and to educate, blurring the line between art and instruction. Public recitations of erotic poetry were common, often taking place in villas, gardens, or taverns. Young men would gather to hear verses laced with suggestion, laughter rising with each clever pun or vivid metaphor. These weren't coy declarations of romantic love. They were bold, unapologetic celebrations of flesh. Some poems describe physical acts in such detail that even modern readers might wince. Yet in Rome, such boldness was considered wit, not vulgarity. To speak freely about sex was a mark of sophistication, not shame. One of the most influential voices of this world was Publius Ovidius Naso, better known as Ovid. His works, especially Ars Amatoria and Amores, were widely read by both the elite and the aspiring. These texts weren't hidden in private libraries. They were shared, quoted, and even gifted to lovers. In Ars Amatoria, Ovid instructs young men on how to seduce women, how to behave in the arena, where to sit in the theatre to increase their chances, and what compliments might win a heart or a knight. It was less a love manual and more a social strategy guide for bedroom success. He didn't stop with advice for men. Later books in the series offered guidance for women as well, suggesting how to maintain a lure, how to manage lovers, and how to navigate jealousy. Ovid's tone was playful, even mischievous, but his message was serious in its reach. For many young Romans, his books were their first formal lessons in seduction, desire, and sexual politics. The state disapproved, but the public consumed his work eagerly. These writings also seeped into education. Boys learning to read Latin would sometimes pass sentences drawn from love poetry. Teachers might gloss over the racier parts, but the students certainly remembered them. Even within philosophical schools, discussions of love and lust were not uncommon. Stoics and Epicureans debated the virtues and dangers of passion, sometimes quoting poets whose words straddled the line between beauty and obscenity. Beyond poetry, music carried the same themes. Songs about lovers, betrayal, and forbidden touch filled the air in Roman banquets. Some tunes were crude, others haunting. Musicians performed in elite dining rooms, sometimes accompanying dances that veered into the erotic. The performers were often enslaved or hired specifically for their sensual appeal. Their movements, lyrics, and gestures reinforced Rome's view that desire was not to be hidden, but orchestrated. In a way, these performances were Rome's ancient version of adult entertainment, just with more togas and lyres. No one found it strange to blend feasting with flirting, music with moaning. To throw a party without some form of central entertainment was considered poor taste. Guests expected laughter, rhythm, and innuendo. Anything less felt stiff. The theatre was yet another stage for these impulses. Roman comedies, especially those adapted from Greek originals, often featured double meanings, physical humor, and scenarios centered around lust and deception. Audiences loved watching characters stumble through romantic misadventures, often driven by their own appetites. Some plays included scenes so explicit that actors would mime sexual acts for shock and amusement. Far from offending, these moments drew applause. Not all Romans were amused. Conservative voices criticized the moral decline, warning that too much exposure to erotic content weakened discipline and distracted from civic duty. Some senators and philosophers called for censorship. On occasion, certain works were banned or burned, but the appetite for such material remained strong. Forbidden verses only became more popular. The more they were denounced, the more they circulated. Erotic graffiti covered the walls of cities like Pompeii. Crude jokes, boastful confessions, and poetic one-liners were etched into stone beside doorways, near fountains, even in latrines. These messages weren't just private outbursts. They reflected a culture where sex talk was as common as gossip. Reading Roman walls today is like scrolling through the ancient equivalent of a social media feed filled with flirtation, bragging, and dirty jokes. Some inscriptions were tender, others were vulgar, a few were surprisingly poetic. But all of them showed how deeply embedded sexual language was in daily life. It wasn't considered taboo to speak of a lover's body or a knight's pleasure. It was almost expected. Silence was the greater offense. If you had an experience, you shared it. If you wanted something, you sang about it. Of course, this openness did not mean freedom for all. While men could joke and boast, women were more carefully watched. A woman who quoted erotic poetry might be called bold or unvirtuous. Performers of both sexes were often exploited, expected to smile and entice without any real power. And while some poets, like Ovid, earned praise, others were punished for stepping beyond what the state deemed acceptable. Still, the sheer volume of surviving erotic literature and inscriptions tells a clear story. Rome viewed sex as a part of life to be discussed, celebrated, and performed. Its culture embraced contradiction. It punished adultery while encouraging flirtation. It preached modesty while hosting orgiastic feasts. And through it all, the written word remained one of its most enduring tools for arousal and amusement. I find it strangely honest that the Romans didn't pretend to be pure. They made no effort to hide their obsessions behind flowery language. Their poems were bold, their songs playful, and their theatres bawdy. It may be jarring to modern readers, but it was utterly Roman in its logic. It's a bit like giving teenagers today a love manual written by a stand-up comedian. You know it's trouble, but they'll read every word. That was the effect Ovid had. He knew exactly how to turn desire into performance, and performance into influence. Sometimes I think their openness says more about our own discomfort than their depravity. They accepted what we still debate. As we leave behind the verses and songs, the next step leads us deeper into physical reality, because what the Romans wrote about, they often built in stone. From brothels to bedrooms, their architecture mirrored their passions, with rooms designed not just for privacy, but for spectacle. As we step into the private chambers and back alleys of ancient Rome, one truth becomes harder to ignore. The Romans were far less constrained by modern ideas of sexual identity. Same-sex relations, particularly between men, were not just tolerated. In many circles, they were expected, even celebrated, as long as certain social rules were followed. It wasn't about who you desired, but how you expressed it. That distinction made all the difference between admiration and shame. In Roman society, the concept of masculinity did not forbid male-male relations. What mattered was who held the dominant role. The man who penetrated maintained his honor. The one who received, especially if he was a freeborn Roman male, risked ridicule or worse. This dynamic was less about affection and more about power. The hierarchy of Roman culture extended into every bedroom. As long as the man preserved his status as the penetrator, his reputation remained intact. This is why relations between older Roman men and their younger male companions, often slaves or freedmen, were common. These relationships weren't hidden in shame. In some cases, they were openly acknowledged and even flaunted. Emperors like Hadrian, who loved the youth Antinous, left behind monuments and coins in his honor. Their story was both political and deeply personal. Antinous' death devastated Hadrian so profoundly that he ordered the young man deified. Statues of Antinous still stand today, carved in marble with the same reverence granted to gods. It's oddly modern to see how public affection between two men didn't necessarily spark outrage, as long as the roles stayed within Roman norms. The contradiction lies in their logic. Dominance equaled virtue, and submission equaled weakness. The mechanics of sex were less important than their social meaning. There are records of symbolic marriages between men, especially in the later empire. Some of these were private, others were witnessed by guests in festive ceremonies. These unions held no legal standing, but they demonstrated how the desire for connection, recognition, and ritual existed even outside the law. Roman satirists often mocked such pairings, but their existence shows how persistent and visible they were. In cities like Pompeii, walls and frescoes revealed far more than one might expect. Paintings of male-male intimacy were found not only in brothels but in private homes. A variety of scenes ranges from humorous to tender, erotic to religious. These images were not hidden. They were part of daily life, viewed as natural expressions of human behavior. Some even suggest these depictions had protective or celebratory meanings, warding off bad luck or honoring fertility gods. If Roman sexuality had a motto, it might have been, "Everything is allowed, but only if the right person does it." That motto captures the twisted fairness of the Roman system. A freeborn man could sleep with male or female partners of the lower status without consequence. But to be seen in a receptive role was seen as a moral failure. This logic even extended into military life. Roman soldiers were forbidden from engaging in passive sexual acts, not for moral reasons, but because it was seen as incompatible with discipline and strength. This rigid view created space for hypocrisy. Men who publicly condemned same-sex behavior might privately enjoy it. Poets like Marshall and Juvenal wrote verses teasing senators and philosophers for their hidden lovers. These jabs weren't just playful, they were political weapons, crafted to unseat rivals or stir public gossip. A line of poetry could end a career if it made the wrong accusation. Women, on the other hand, were barely part of this conversation. Female-female intimacy was often ignored or dismissed as harmless. Roman writers rarely describe lesbian relationships in detail. When they did, it was usually as a curiosity or insult. The lack of regulation or discussion doesn't mean it didn't exist. It simply means it wasn't considered threatening. Roman men, in their arrogance, assumed that without man, sex was incomplete. That said, there were women who defied those expectations. Ancient texts mention women who dressed as men, took male lovers, or pursued women with boldness. Some were mocked, others feared, but most of their stories are lost to time, filtered through the pens of men who couldn't quite understand or accept their choices. Still, their presence hints at a deeper world of sexual identity that was never fully recorded. I find it telling that Roman society allowed more freedom in act than in roles. They weren't afraid of homosexuality, they were afraid of being seen as weak. That fear shaped laws, customs, and even art. The images of lovers on Pompeii's walls weren't warnings. They were reflections, showing how desire flowed freely, but always downstream of power. It reminds me of how some modern societies still care less about who you love, and more about whether you act right according to your gender. The same scripts keep playing, just with new costumes. Rome had togas. We have suits and Instagram filters, but the anxiety is the same. Sometimes I wonder how many lives were twisted because a man had to pretend strength meant denying affection. That lie lasted centuries. It still echoes today in policies and slurs, in silences. The Romans didn't invent sexual policing, but they made it an art form. In the end, same-sex love in Rome was never really about love at all. It was about status. It was about power. It was about making sure everyone stayed in their place, even in bed. That doesn't erase the moments of tenderness or connection that surely existed, but it frames them within a world where even intimacy had a hierarchy. As we move forward, the Roman obsession with rank and dominance reveals its shadow side, because the same system that permitted sexual freedom for some allowed the most horrific abuses of others, especially those too young to resist. That is the darker turn we must take next. Despite the open expression of sexual freedom among elite Roman men, marriage remained one of the most rigid and regulated aspects of society. For many Roman families, especially among the upper classes, marriage had little to do with love or companionship. It was a tool for preserving lineage, consolidating wealth, and maintaining social status. A husband and wife could live in the same home for decades, and yet remain emotionally distant, bound only by duty and bloodline. Weddings were often arranged before the bride had even reached maturity. The purpose was not emotional fulfillment, but biological production. A wife was expected to bear children as soon as possible, preferably sons, and remain loyal to her husband even if he did not return that loyalty. Her body was not her own, but the property of two families and ultimately the Roman state. She was a vessel for heritage, nothing more. Roman law placed the weight of family honor on the woman's shoulders. A wife who was suspected of infidelity could be divorced, publicly shamed, or worse. Her actions, real or imagined, reflected not only on her but on the men around her. Her father, her husband, even her adult sons could suffer reputational damage if she failed to live up to her expected role. That role was simple: remain quiet, obedient, and fertile. The same pressure was not placed on men. Her Roman husband was free to pursue pleasure wherever he chose, as long as it was done discreetly or with partners considered socially acceptable. Prostitutes, male or female slaves, and even concubines were seen as legitimate outlets for male desire. This double standard was not hidden. It was openly acknowledged, even joked about in literature and gossip. It's hard not to roll your eyes when you realize that Rome had rules for everything except male restraint. The expectations placed on women were suffocating, while men were given the freedom to behave however they pleased, so long as they kept appearances intact. In many homes, especially in the wealthier districts of Rome, the emotional lives of husbands and wives existed in separate orbits. A man might spend his nights drinking and cavorting with companions, while his wife remained secluded in the inner quarters, managing the household and raising the children. Contact between the two could be minimal, even after years of marriage. Letters from the period show more concern for property and politics than for affection or care. Some women, especially those born into more liberal households, found ways to carve out space for themselves. They read, wrote poetry, engaged in philosophy, or hosted salons. But for many others, especially those of the middle class, life was confined to silence and service. They were taught to avoid eye contact, speak softly, and never question their husband's choices. The idea of a romantic partnership between equals was not just rare, it was practically non-existent. Modern couples complain about growing apart over time, but Roman spouses often started out distant and just stayed that way. Marriage wasn't meant to fulfill you emotionally, it was meant to stabilize the empire. In public life, a married woman might appear at her husband's side during ceremonies, but she rarely had a voice in decisions. Behind closed doors, she might wield influence, especially over her sons, but this power was informal and fragile. A single misstep could erase years of careful behavior. A rumor, a servant's testimony, or a neighbor's observation could turn a respected matron into a disgrace overnight. Despite all this, the Roman state depended on these marriages. Without them, there would be no heirs, no alliances, and no continuity. The family was the smallest unit of the empire, and marriage was its foundation. That's why so much emphasis was placed on maintaining its image, even when its reality was hollow. There are preserved legal documents detailing dowries, divorce settlements, and custody of children. These weren't just dry records. They were evidence of how transactional Roman marriage could be. A woman could be sent back to her father's house like returned merchandise. The only thing expected of her was that she leave behind legitimate children. You can sense the emotional hunger that must have lingered beneath the surface for many women, locked in roles they didn't choose, surrounded by expectations they couldn't challenge. Many of them found subtle ways to resist. Some became patrons of the arts. Others used religion as a form of personal expression. A few, rare and brave, pursued relationships on their own terms, but at great risk. Among the elite, there were women like Julia, the daughter of Emperor Augustus, who became infamous for her affairs. But her fate was a warning, not an inspiration. Despite her status, she was eventually exiled, her lovers punished, and her name stained. Rome allowed women to be clever, but not bold. Once they crossed the invisible line, the punishment was swift and harsh. I've always found it striking how Rome built an empire on control, but allowed its own homes to be so emotionally bankrupt. The contradiction is hard to miss. They conquered the world, but failed to cultivate intimacy at home. In literature, some Roman poets tried to write about love, but even those verses were tinged with power dynamics and possessiveness. Love, if it appeared at all, was rarely mutual. It was about conquest, devotion, or obsession. Few lines capture tenderness, and even fewer acknowledge the wife as a partner rather than an obligation. And so Roman marriages continued, generation after generation, built not on affection but on necessity. They were alliances, contracts, performances. Behind closed doors, some couples may have found companionship, but for most, The marriage bed was colder than marble and just as unforgiving. Up next, we'll step away from the cold halls of marriage and into the hot, crowded streets of Roman festivals. Because when duty ended, indulgence began. And that's where the next shock awaits. In a society where Roman women were largely confined to their homes, expected to be silent, modest, and loyal, a strange paradox began to emerge. The very role considered most shameful, that of a prostitute, offered certain freedoms that respectable women could only dream of. While matrons were watched, judged, and bound by expectations of virtue, registered prostitutes could move about more freely, dress how they pleased, and even speak boldly in public. And so, some Roman women found an unexpected loophole. They pretended to be prostitutes. This was not a decision made lightly. For a woman of status, even pretending to belong to a lower class could damage her reputation forever. But for some, the risk was worth the reward. To register as a meretrix or sex worker meant stepping outside the suffocating rules of proper womanhood. You were no longer bound by the same codes of behavior. You could own your body, your time, and your choices. That kind of freedom was intoxicating. Women who adopted this disguise could leave their homes without a male escort. They could wear brightly colored dresses, show more skin, and reject the heavy veils that noble women were expected to wear. In a society obsessed with modesty, at least when it came to women, this visual freedom alone must have felt like a rebellion. But even more powerful was the social space it opened. As a supposed prostitute, a woman could speak more openly, flirt with men, and even refuse advances without being accused of disrespect. It says a lot about Roman society that pretending to be a sex worker gave women more freedom than being a wife. That inversion of values tells us where real control lived, not in law, but in appearances. There are scattered records and rumors of wealthy women slipping into the brothel districts, not for work, but for anonymity. In those places, no one expected them to behave like daughters or wives. There was laughter, conversation, and sometimes even intellectual exchange. In fact, some women used this disguise to meet with lovers or political allies away from their household's watchful eyes. And as long as no one recognized them, they could live briefly in a world without judgment. Some went even further. They played the role not just for a night but as a part-time identity. They kept their homes and servants, but after dark, adopted new names and personas. Roman satire and gossip columns often alluded to these double lives. One poet mocked a woman who wore the stola of a matron by day and the sheer tunic of a meretrix by night. But the mocking tone couldn't hide the fascination. These women were seen as daring, even dangerous, because they refused to be boxed in. Compared to today's secret dating apps and burner accounts, Rome's version of double life required real courage. There were no second chances if you were caught. A single slip, a familiar face, or a spiteful rival could expose the ruse and destroy your standing forever. And yet, some women not only got away with it, they thrived. There were cases where a woman's reputation as a courtesan became more influential than her family's name. Some of the most famous women in Roman society were former or active sex workers. They attended banquets, wrote poetry, and even owned property. Their fame sometimes eclipsed that of noble women, whose voices were rarely heard outside their own walls. For young girls growing up in such a world, the message was both confusing and clear. On one hand, they were told to value purity and silence. On the other hand, they saw powerful women gain attention, lovers, and influence by stepping outside those rules. The contradiction created tension in the culture. Fathers and husbands tried harder to lock things down. More rules were added. More surveillance followed. But desire is hard to regulate, and so is the hunger for autonomy. Some Roman writers were scandalized by this trend. They wrote bitterly about wives behaving like harlots, as if the line between the two had dissolved. But their anger masked anxiety. When women discovered even a sliver of freedom, it threatened the whole structure. If wives could become courtesans and return home untouched, what did that mean for the system of marriage, dowry, and control? The state didn't have a clear answer. Laws around prostitution were inconsistent and often unenforced. There were taxes to be paid and certain districts to stay within, but beyond that, much was left to social enforcement. That made the line between respectable and scandalous dangerously thin. A woman might be called a whore for wearing the wrong color or speaking too loudly. In such an environment, reclaiming the label on her terms became an act of defiance. It's striking how much agency some women found in the very space meant to humiliate them. By stepping into roles society tried to shame, they flipped the script, even if only briefly. It wasn't about embracing vice. It was about escaping the narrow hallway of virtue. Of course, this kind of double life wasn't possible for everyone. Most women didn't have the luxury of risk. For them, stepping outside their roles could mean ruin or violence, but those who dared, who wore the mask and slipped into the night, left behind a crack in the wall, a whisper that things didn't have to be this way forever. We can still see echoes of them in Roman literature, graffiti, and satire. The bold woman, the unruly wife, the disguised matron. They were mocked, yes, but they were remembered. In a world that tried to forget women outside of motherhood, that's no small victory. Next, we'll step into another contradiction, the Roman obsession with public nudity and bathhouses, where shame met exhibition and where control gave way to indulgence. Things are about to get steamier in more ways than one. Under Roman law and social custom, a woman's body was never really her own. It belonged to her father until she married, and then to her husband. Her value rested in her purity, her silence, and her loyalty, not just emotionally but physically. When a woman broke those expectations, or was even suspected of it, the consequences were swift and often brutal. Unlike their male counterparts, Roman women were not allowed the luxury of discretion or mistake. The state and the household both expected a level of moral perfection that no man was required to match. An upper-class Roman man could have mistresses, male lovers, or casual encounters with slaves, and face no legal consequence. But if a woman dared to have sex outside of marriage, the penalties could be life-changing. Adultery was not just a betrayal of a husband. It was framed as a threat to the integrity of the family, the lineage, and by extension, the state. To commit adultery was to inject uncertainty into inheritance, legitimacy, and public reputation. And for that, Roman women paid a high price. The punishments for a woman caught in adultery varied depending on her status and her husband's mood. At best, she might be publicly divorced and disgraced. At worst, she could be stripped of her dowry, banished, or mutilated. One known punishment was the severing of the nose, a visible and permanent mark that made her unmarriageable and socially ruined. Some men went further, especially in private, administering their forms of justice with beatings or starvation. Roman law did not always step in. It often stepped aside. It is ironic how the system punished women more for being violated than men for violating. If a woman was raped and failed to prove it with witnesses, an almost impossible task, she could still be punished for dishonor. The burden of proof sat on her shoulders, not the attackers. That meant many women stayed silent, knowing that speaking out could destroy what was left of their lives. In some cases, the rapist might even be pardoned if he claimed the woman seduced him, or if she was considered too provocative in behavior or dress. Compared to today's conversations about victim blaming, Rome turned it into official policy. There was no distinction between consent and coercion in many cases, especially when the victim was a woman of a lower status or a slave. Even worse, these expectations were not just enforced by law or men. Other women, especially older matrons, sometimes became the enforcers of moral discipline. They gossiped, judged, and distanced themselves from any woman thought to have misstepped. Respectable women were not only expected to behave well, They were expected to monitor each other. It was a form of social self-policing that ensured the hierarchy remained intact, even when the state was not watching. Meanwhile, men operated with impunity. A husband could visit brothels, sleep with his slaves, or even seduce his friends' wives, and society would look the other way. The double standard was not just cultural, it was embedded in Roman law itself. The Lex Julia de Adulteris Curcendis, passed under Augustus, made adultery a public crime, but only really enforced it when a woman was involved. Husbands were even encouraged to bring their adulterous wives to court to avoid being seen as weak or cuckolded. But if the husband strayed, there was no corresponding shame or trial. This created a world where women had to navigate every interaction with care. A smile could be misinterpreted. A rumor could start in a bathhouse and travel faster than a chariot. To remain respectable, a woman had to perform virtue constantly in how she dressed, walked, spoke, and even looked at others. And it was not just young women who suffered under this gaze. Widows, older wives, and even childless women were all subject to the same pressures. Some tried to subvert these rules quietly. They wrote poetry under male pseudonyms, held private gatherings, or formed intimate friendships in secret. But they always risked exposure. One scandal could ruin not just a woman, but her entire household. Her father could lose public office. Her children could be disinherited. The cost of being seen as sexually autonomous was never limited to the individual. It is hard not to feel that Roman society was designed to break women before they ever made a mistake. The idea of female honor was so fragile that it could shatter under a glance or a rumor, and once broken, there was no recovery. Even emperors, when trying to enforce morality, revealed how hollow the ideals were. Augustus famously exiled his daughter Julia for adultery, banishing her to a remote island with no male visitors allowed. Her crime was loving too freely, but her father's many affairs were never questioned. His role as emperor allowed him to define morality while ignoring it himself. Over time, these legal and cultural restrictions narrowed women's lives more and more. Their physical bodies became the terrain of political control, whether through forced marriage, legal penalties, or social exile. Rome made it clear a woman's sexuality was not her own. It was a mirror for her family's pride, her husband's control, and her state's power. The tragedy is not just that women were punished. It is that they were conditioned to see punishment as natural, to suffer in silence, to accept blame, to internalize shame. These were lessons taught from girlhood. They were not just taught obedience. They were taught to believe it was honorable. And yet, history remembers them. The quiet ones, the defiant ones, the broken ones. Even in records written mostly by men, their stories bleed through. There are glimpses of resistance, sorrow, and endurance. Rome may have tried to erase them, but in doing so, it revealed just how powerful they were. Next, we enter the world of elite Roman parties where women found surprising leverage, sometimes by becoming what society feared most. If punishment for women was harsh and relentless, the freedom given to powerful men seemed limitless. Beyond the carefully written laws and household expectations, there were corridors of Roman life where even the most twisted behaviors found protection. Once a man had enough wealth, status, or connections, almost nothing was off the table. Depravity didn't disqualify you from power. Sometimes, it helped you hold on to it. The deeper you look into the private lives of the Roman elite, the more you see a pattern that wasn't just about indulgence, but about how power warped every boundary of decency. Accounts from Roman historians and satirists often described acts that today would be unthinkable. These weren't the stories of criminals hiding in alleyways. They were centered around palaces, villas, and lavish banquets. Some emperors, like Caligula and Nero, became infamous not just for their political chaos but for their personal pleasures. Caligula was accused of forcing noble women to perform publicly in sex shows, treating the imperial palace as a stage for perversion. Nero allegedly enjoyed theatrical displays of violence dressed as an animal, where humans were tied down and treated as prey. Whether every detail of these stories was true or exaggerated, they paint a disturbing picture of what society allowed when a man stood at the top. When you read these records, you get the sense that shame did not exist in the imperial court, only spectacle. These acts were not hidden in shadows but often presented with ceremony. Everything could be justified as performance, ritual, or even divine imitation. It was said that if something pleased the gods or entertained the guests, it needed no further justification. That's the problem with power left unchecked. It doesn't need to explain itself. In some parts of Roman society, religion and sexuality were woven together in uncomfortable ways. Certain cults, especially fringe or imported ones, had rituals involving sex or symbolic fertility acts. While not mainstream, these practices were tolerated or even respected in certain circles. The line between religious devotion and personal gratification became difficult to trace. Statues of gods with exaggerated sexual features stood openly in temples. Amulets shaped like male genitals were worn for protection. Murals showing acts of group sex or domination were placed in public bathhouses or private bedrooms. The grotesque wasn't seen as shocking. It was normalized. The more disturbing stories involve the role of animals in Roman sexual entertainment. While documentation is limited, some ancient writers did describe performances that included bestial elements. These were not just wild rumors passed by enemies, but allegations written into biographies of emperors by Roman historians themselves. Nero, for instance, was said to have arranged shows where men or women were tied to stakes and attacked by people dressed as animals or, in some interpretations, actual animals. These events were described as part of the games or private festivities. Even if only some of these accounts were true, the fact that they were believed tells us a lot about what people thought their rulers were capable of. Imagine a modern leader being remembered not for their policies, but for tying people up and mimicking wild animals for arousal. That's the scale of deviation we're dealing with here. In ancient Rome, cruelty didn't stop someone from being admired. It sometimes became part of their legend. Writers who chronicled these emperors didn't always condemn them. Some just described their acts with a strange tone of detachment, as if nothing could surprise them anymore. The reality was that nothing would be done to stop these practices if the man in question had enough status. Laws are applied differently depending on your place in the hierarchy. A common man caught committing any act deemed obscene could be beaten, shamed, or worse. A senator or emperor, on the other hand, might call the same act a performance or a ritual. The system didn't just tolerate inequality, it depended on it. There were also private rooms within elite homes that catered specifically to taboo tastes. Archaeological digs in cities like Pompeii have revealed murals and objects that suggest the existence of dedicated spaces for sexual experimentation. Some of them decorated with scenes of bondage, domination, or exaggerated human-animal hybrids. These weren't hidden in shame. They were proudly displayed. Guests would walk into these spaces and be expected to laugh, admire, or participate. What strikes me the most is not that individuals indulged in extremes, but that the system allowed and even celebrated it. You could abuse, degrade, and humiliate others in the name of entertainment as long as you were rich enough. There was no moral line, just a social rank, and for those at the top, even the darkest urges could be presented as culture. Philosophers occasionally tried to push back. Seneca, a Stoic thinker close to Nero, wrote about temperance and control. But even he struggled to reconcile his ideals with the reality of court life. His warnings were often drowned out by the applause of the crowd. Roman society didn't want to hear about self-restraint. It wanted bread, wine, and scandal. And those who provided it most extravagantly won favor, not condemnation. That kind of culture didn't just affect the elite, it trickled down. When the most visible people in a society act without limits, everyone else slowly adapts. What was once seen as shocking becomes amusing. What was once taboo becomes tradition, and that's the scariest part. The empire that built roads and aqueducts also built a culture where screams could be part of the evening show, where shame was considered a weakness, where cruelty was dressed as celebration. There is no denying that Rome left behind remarkable legacies, but it also left scars, hidden in the writings and artifacts that remain. They speak of a world where desire and dominance were the same, where no act was too far if it came with applause, and where a man could stand naked beside a chained victim and still be called divine. Next, we'll look not at the palace but at the stage. Roman theatre wasn't just drama and poetry. It was also a space where sex, satire, and shame played out for all to see. And what happened on that stage tells us even more about what society expected you to laugh at or desire. If a Roman slave was considered property, the eunuch was something even more specific, not just owned, but reshaped. Castration in ancient Rome was not always for punishment or medical need. Sometimes it was simply about control, about turning a person into something else, someone easier to use. Boys were selected, often from conquered populations, to be made into eunuchs and then trained for service. Once their bodies were changed, they were placed into roles no free man would accept. They were guards in women's quarters, bath attendants for noble ladies, singers in the homes of the elite, or even sexual servants to powerful men and women who preferred pleasure without consequence. The process itself was violent. It usually happened young, before puberty. With crude tools and little care, the removal of the testicles, or sometimes more, left permanent damage. These boys grew into men with high voices, soft features, and no real autonomy. They were kept close by the aristocracy, not for respect, but for utility. It's hard to imagine a society where your value increases after they destroy part of your body. The Roman elite saw this not as cruelty but as improvement. A modified servant was a safer servant. The most common place for eunuchs was in the service of noble women. Roman men were deeply anxious about controlling female sexuality. A eunuch, being seen as neither fully man nor fully woman, became the perfect compromise. He could help dress the women, attend them in the bath, deliver their letters, and even serve as a companion. All of this without posing a threat to their reputation. It was not uncommon for high-ranking women to grow attached to their eunuchs, trusting them more than their own husbands. But no matter how close the relationship, these men were always reminded of their place. Their mutilation followed them into every room. Beyond domestic service, some eunuchs were used for entertainment. Their voices, preserved by early castration, remained unnaturally high. This made them prize singers for wealthy Romans who loved music at private banquets. Others, however, were chosen for more explicit roles. In households known for decadence, eunuchs were expected to entertain in more personal ways. Their lack of masculinity made them ideal for clients who wanted to indulge in same-sex acts while avoiding the shame of being seen with a real man. In a world obsessed with status, even sexual orientation had to be negotiated through hierarchy. There are records suggesting that some emperors kept personal eunuchs, not just for service, but for sex. These boys and men had no legal standing and no ability to refuse. They were treated more like objects than people, expected to be available at all times. In some cases, they were even dressed in elaborate costumes to heighten their appeal. Their identity was erased. They were not men, not slaves, not citizens. They were functioning. It feels disturbing that the same society that built aqueducts and codified laws also saw value in creating eunuchs for pleasure. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Rome was a civilization obsessed with structure, but it structured its cruelty with just as much care. Eunuchs were assigned rooms, clothing, and tasks. Everything about them was managed, except their freedom. They were not allowed to have families, property, or even their own decisions about food and clothing. In modern times, we think of workplace exploitation as a serious issue. Long hours, no pay, unsafe environments. But in Rome, some people were stripped of their very biology to meet workplace expectations. Imagine applying for a job today and being told the first requirement is to lose part of your body. That was the reality for these men. There was no interview, no consent, only pain, and then service. What makes this darker is that many of these eunuchs were not forgotten. They appear in poetry, in satire, even in love letters. Roman writers made jokes about their high voices, their thin bodies, and their supposed emotional weakness. Even in death, they were mocked. Their graves rarely carried their real names, just labels, titles. And behind every label was a lifetime of service that no one cared to remember. Some households had multiple eunuchs, each with a specialized role. One might prepare the mistress for sleep, another manage her jewelry, and another entertain guests with song. All of them operated in silence. They could not object, and any sign of distress might be seen as weakness or ingratitude. Their pain was supposed to be invisible. That's how the elite justified it. They believed that once the body was changed, so was the soul. The man they once were had vanished. What remained was a function, not a person. Even the law treated them differently. If a eunuch was harmed, there were no standard protections. If he were killed, it was treated more like the destruction of furniture than the murder of a human being. That tells you everything about how Rome viewed them, not just disposable, but below recognition. Their castration removed their voice both literally and politically. There's something terrifying about how ordinary this all seemed to them. Castration wasn't hidden. It wasn't considered scandalous. It was just one more way to shape society to the desires of the powerful. For those born into the wrong family or captured during the wrong war, there was no escaping that fate. And for those who lived through it, there was no way to reclaim their life. They were altered not just for utility, but for the pleasure of others. In the grand villas of Rome, the laughter at parties often masked someone's permanent loss. While guests drank wine and listened to music, the eunuch stood nearby, smiling when asked, bowing when required, and never forgetting what had been taken from him. He couldn't run, he couldn't scream, he could only serve, and yet, even within such cruelty, Rome still managed to see itself as civilized. It wrote laws, it sculpted gods, it mapped the stars, but beneath it all, behind closed doors, it mutilated boys so the rich could feel more comfortable. That contradiction was not hidden, it was designed. Next, we look into how Roman society blurred the line between punishment and perversion, when pain became theatre and sex was used as spectacle. If reshaping the human body was one way the Romans chased control, then manipulating desire through potions was another. In the search for affection, power, or simply lust, Romans turned to mixtures that promised to arouse, bind, or inflame. These were not the secret tricks of witches hidden in the forest. These were household practices, marketplace exchanges, and whispered recipes passed from one elite salon to another. Aphrodisiacs and love spells were a regular part of Roman life, woven into the way people thought about attraction and power. Common ingredients were nothing short of bizarre by modern standards. Dried goat testicles were ground into powder and stirred into wine. Bat blood, believed to contain the spirit of darkness and mystery, was used in love potions meant to make a partner more obedient. Herbs like satyrion and rocket were steeped in oil or fermented in wine, producing a drink that was both spicy and bitter. Vendors in the markets of Rome carried small bottles of these concoctions wrapped in leather or tucked into carved bone containers. They were sold discreetly, but not illegally. There were even professionals, known as philtropos, who made custom aphrodisiacs on commission. Wealthy clients might approach them in secret, describing the object of their desire and the nature of the obstacle. Was it a spouse losing interest, a lover straying, a man ignoring a mistress? The philtropos would then combine roots, minerals, and animal products into a tincture that promised results. In a world without dating apps, nothing says romance like powdered goat testicles in your wine glass. These remedies were not always subtle. Some had strong smells or tasted awful, but users believed in them, especially if the desired partner started acting more affectionate. Whether the effects were real or imagined hardly mattered. The belief itself carried weight. A confident person, convinced their potion had worked, would act differently. That change alone often altered relationships. Women in particular made use of love potions. Unlike men, who could assert their will more directly, women often operated through hidden influence. A wife fearing her husband's wandering eye might slip a potion into his evening wine. A courtesan hoping to secure a wealthy patron might feed him enchanted honey cakes. These acts were not seen as foolish or shameful. They were pragmatic. Love was hard to secure in a society where marriage was often arranged and passion was not guaranteed. Some of the most curious practices came from magical rituals combined with aphrodisiacs. A woman might collect her lover's sweat-stained clothing, burn part of it, and mix the ashes with wine. Another might scratch the name of her beloved into a piece of lead and bury it under his doorstep. These rites were often paired with the ingestion of stimulating herbs. Desire, in this context, was not left to chance. It was engineered, one strange step at a time. Compared to modern marketing for scented candles and body sprays, the Romans really went all in. They didn't just hope to be noticed, they wanted to alter fate. Some texts even mention using menstrual blood as an ingredient in binding spells, hidden in food or drink. It was believed to tie the recipient emotionally and sexually to the giver. Today, that would result in a criminal charge and probably a lot of therapy. Many potions were designed not only to arouse but to bind. They were made to inspire obsession, not just lust. The Romans believed that a person under the influence of a powerful love spell could become loyal, even submissive. The balance of power in a relationship could be shifted entirely through these concoctions. Some women wielded them to maintain control in situations where they otherwise had little say. It makes sense, in a society so obsessed with dominance, that even love had to be conquered chemically. There was no room for unpredictability. Everything, including affection, had to be managed. This also created an entire underground culture of potion sellers, secret scribes, and amateur magicians. They thrived in the cracks of Roman society, serving those who preferred subtle power to brute force. Not all attempts worked. Of course, some potions made people sick. Others did nothing at all. But when they failed, it was rarely the recipe that was blamed. Instead, people believed the victim had been cursed or was protected by stronger magic. This belief kept the cycle going. It gave customers hope and gave sellers business. Faith in the unseen was part of the formula. Among the upper class, such practices were not just tolerated but expected. At lavish parties, exotic dishes were laced with substances believed to stir desire. Dancers wore oils infused with stimulating herbs. Perfumes were chosen not for scent alone, but for their supposed effect on the libido. Even bedroom decor was influenced by beliefs in the erotic energy. Statues, carvings, and wall paintings often included references to fertility gods or scenes of ecstatic union. It wasn't all romantic. Some potions were made for coercion. They were slipped to servants, rivals, or even political targets. In rare cases, aphrodisiacs were used to create a scandal. A senator made foolish by love could be manipulated, blackmailed, or removed. These darker uses were risky but not uncommon. The line between passion and power was thin, and Roman citizens crossed it often. What's perhaps most telling is how normal it all was. These practices weren't restricted to outcasts or the desperate. They were mainstream. Recipes were found on walls, written in family recipe books, and passed from mother to daughter. Love, after all, was a dangerous thing. The Romans simply tried to give themselves an advantage, whether through flowers or fluids. I find it fascinating that beneath all their laws and rituals, The Romans still turned to bat blood for relationship advice. It shows just how little has changed in some ways. We still search for control over something as unpredictable as love. The methods are cleaner now, but the motives remain familiar. As we follow the Roman obsession with control deeper, we begin to see how even punishment was tied to sexual humiliation. In the next part, we'll look at how nudity, public shame, and assault were used as tools of dominance disguised as justice. If desire could be controlled with herbs and incantations, then power could be enforced through belief. In ancient Rome, the intersection between religion and sex created a murky space, where boundaries became increasingly blurred. While certain rituals were symbolic, others went far beyond gestures. Sexual acts, disguised as religious offerings or divine rites, became a disturbing part of specific sects and secret cults. These weren't isolated oddities. In some circles, they were accepted, even revered. One of the most unsettling aspects of Roman religious life was how easily sexual violence could be reframed as spiritual duty. Within a handful of mystery cults, acts of forced intimacy were not only permitted but embedded into ritual. Some temples were known to host sacred unions, where women, often young and lower class, were expected to submit as part of ceremonial offerings. These acts were wrapped in mythic language, invoking gods of fertility or chaos, but for the victims, it was simply abuse with a divine stamp. There were groups that pushed the idea of symbolic death and rebirth through physical surrender. The problem arose when the line between willing participation and coercion disappeared. Those in positions of authority, priests, seers, even nobles funding the temple had access and immunity. Their actions were protected by the framework of belief. They could claim the gods required it, and once that justification was made, there was little room for resistance. Some rituals involved initiates being brought into darkened chambers, blindfolded, surrounded by incense and chanting. What began as a spiritual preparation ended with acts that today would be seen as clear violations. But without written contracts, and with religion holding enormous sway, those who suffered rarely spoke out. Even if they did, their voices carried little weight. Power structures leaned heavily in favor of those leading the rites. It's horrifying how easily divine inspiration can be used as an excuse to avoid jail time. That's true across history, but Rome made it almost bureaucratic. Some temples even had written codes justifying divine union, especially when invoking fertility gods like Liber, Bacchus, or Venus. Celebrations often spiraled into frenzies where wine, music, and bodies blurred all moral lines. The Bacchanalia festivals, for instance, became notorious for their wild sexual displays. These events, initially intended to honor Bacchus, god of wine and ecstasy, soon gained a reputation for excess. Men and women of all classes mingled, sometimes masked, often intoxicated. Within this haze, acts of dominance and exploitation were difficult to distinguish from celebration. Roman authorities did attempt to suppress these gatherings at times, citing moral decay, but the lure was too strong. Pleasure, when fused with divine legitimacy, became nearly impossible to contain. The idea of sex as sacrifice wasn't always violent, but it was frequently unequal. Those offering themselves were told it was noble, that the gods favored their submission. Yet the ones receiving those offerings were rarely low in status. They were not equals meeting in spiritual union. They were powerful men, receiving what they felt entitled to, cloaked in robes and incense instead of armor and sword. Compared to today's so-called wellness cults, the Romans were basically running adult theme parks with a priest on payroll. The rituals often had theatrical elements, torches, chanting, garlands, and even animal masks. But at the core was the same old story, someone with power convincing someone without it, that suffering was meaningful. What makes these practices especially troubling is the way victims were made invisible. They were not always named in records. Often, they were referred to as the offering, the vessel, or simply not mentioned at all. The language used stripped them of humanity. It turned them into parts of a script, necessary props in someone else's performance. And because it was written down by those in charge, that narrative stayed dominant for centuries. Even when Rome converted to Christianity, echoes of this dynamic persisted. Some early Christian sects condemned sexual excess while quietly replicating power abuses under different names. The shift was less about protecting the vulnerable, and more about changing who held the authority to define what was holy. It's hard not to notice that the costumes changed more than the behavior. There are accounts, rare but disturbing, of children being involved in temple rituals. Whether real or exaggerated, they point to a society where protection was not guaranteed by youth or innocence. In a culture obsessed with hierarchy, purity could be exploited just as easily as strength, and when challenged, perpetrators could hide behind their status. High priests, senators, and even emperors often escaped accountability. In one famous scandal, members of a cult dedicated to a foreign goddess were accused of using their rituals as fronts for orgies, sacrifices, and even murder. The Senate investigated and outlawed the group, but not before years of unchecked activity. It's telling that the intervention only came after political pressure, not moral outrage. Rome was pragmatic, not compassionate. I find it disturbing how silence was baked into the ritual. Victims were trained not to question, not to accuse, and definitely not to resist. In some ways, that's more dangerous than open violence. It creates a culture where harm is normalized and passed off as destiny. While these examples don't reflect every Roman religious practice, they do highlight a darker side of Roman spirituality, one where belief and power work together to justify anything. Sexual crimes, when masked by incense and Latin prayers, were less likely to face scrutiny, and so they continued, unchallenged, for generations. In the next part, we will explore another shadowed layer of Roman culture, how public punishment often included sexual humiliation. Whether carved into stone or carried out in the forum, shame was wielded like a blade, cutting deeper than chains ever could. While temples offered spiritual justification for sexual exploitation, the amphitheater provided a more direct spectacle. In ancient Rome, not all contests involved swords and shields. Some involved nothing more than naked bodies and an audience eager for stimulation. Sex, in certain public venues, wasn't just permitted, it was performed, measured, wagered upon, and celebrated with the same intensity as chariot races or gladiatorial duels. Among the more disturbing practices that flourished under the Roman appetite for spectacle were sexual contests, often involving slaves. These weren't spontaneous affairs. They were organized, timed, and at times announced alongside traditional events. Men and women, typically chosen from the enslaved population, were forced to engage in sexual acts for the amusement of the crowd. Their performance was critiqued, cheered, and sometimes even judged like a sport. It was not uncommon for a particularly attractive slave to be trained not for housework or field labor, but for sexual display. These individuals were taught endurance, rhythm, and seductive techniques as if learning a formal discipline. They were dressed in elaborate but easily removable garments, paraded before the audience, and then instructed to perform. More creative, vigorous, or shocking the act, more praise they earned. Sometimes there were multiple rounds, sometimes a single climactic show. Either way, the event turned private intimacy into grotesque entertainment. Only the Romans could turn humiliation into a group hobby and still call it culture. While other societies might have hidden such desires behind closed doors, Rome allowed them to unfold in public, framed as a test of stamina or virility. Audience members placed bets on which performer would last longer or provide greater satisfaction to a designated partner. Wagers were taken openly, and prize money, collected by the owners, was part of the draw. Some of these contests included famed gladiators. These men, already elevated to near celebrity status by their combat in the arena, were also sometimes expected to satisfy elite Roman women or serve as guests in sexually charged events. Their bodies, hardened by training and adorned with scars, were seen as both tools of violence and objects of desire. Some were rented out for private events. Others were put into staged contests where their physicality was tested in more intimate ways. The practice blurred the lines between human and commodity in deeply unsettling ways. These individuals had no choice in the matter. They were possessions being used to titillate, and the more skilled they were, the more often they were chosen. The audience rarely considered what it meant to be on that stage, stripped of dignity and used as a form of weekend amusement. There are recorded cases of entire brothels being temporarily moved into amphitheatres for special events. The stage would be set, torches lit, and music played as the contest began. Crowd reactions could be loud, raucous, and sometimes cruel. Winners might be paraded around like champions. Losers were often mocked or punished. In extreme cases, failure to satisfy could even lead to execution, especially if the act was part of a larger public ritual or punishment. It's hard not to compare this to modern reality shows, except with far higher stakes and absolutely no consent. The crowd's obsession with watching others in vulnerable states hasn't disappeared. It has only evolved. What Rome did in stone arenas, others now watch through screens. There's some evidence to suggest that these sexual performances also had religious elements woven in. In certain festivals, particularly those honoring fertility deities, sex contests were seen as imitations of divine coupling. The winners were thought to carry luck, virility, or divine favor, and were sometimes even offered symbolic roles in the festival's closing rites. But at the core, it was still exploitation wrapped in sacred language. The role of women in these performances varied. Female slaves were also forced to compete in sexual endurance or performance contests. Sometimes they were paired with multiple partners. Sometimes they were used to humiliate prisoners, soldiers, or even condemned criminals. The point was never mutual pleasure. It was performance under pressure, directed by others, and consumed by strangers. It leaves a bitter taste to think about how bodies were treated as tools for entertainment without the slightest regard for autonomy. There was no choice, no exit, and no audience sympathy. These contests were as normalized as any other form of Roman entertainment, and their brutality was simply another facet of the empire's appetite for control. In elite Roman homes, private versions of these contests also took place. Wealthy patrons might host sex games at parties, inviting guests to judge, score, or even join in. The performers, again, had no say. These parties were often masked, lubricated with heavy wine, and carried on deep into the night. The next morning, all that remained were rumors, and rumors were rarely kind to the ones forced to perform. Rome's legal system, structured to protect property above all else, offered no recourse. A slave's complaint was meaningless. Even free persons, if caught up in such games through coercion or blackmail, had little chance of justice. Honor, in this context, belonged only to those with citizenship, wealth, and status. Everyone else was there to serve, and in this case, the service was bodily. Eventually, as Christian influence spread, some of these spectacles were officially banned, but habits rooted in entertainment and power were not so easily erased. Variations of these practices continued in more private settings, shielded from the new moral codes but still echoing the same logic that desire, when mixed with domination, could be made into sport. In the next part, we turn to the bedrooms of emperors themselves, where excess reached new heights. There, personal pleasure became imperial policy, and the line between ruler and predator blurred entirely. After the shouting faded in the arena, and the masks came off at the drunken parties, Rome still found ways to carry its obsessions back into the home, not through hidden scrolls or secretive whispers, but directly onto the dishes, cups, and decorative pottery of everyday life. For many Romans, erotic imagery wasn't something tucked away in the shadows. It was something they ate off of, drank from, and displayed proudly on shelves and walls. Erotic scenes were painted in meticulous detail on ceramic vases, bronze trays, and even oil lamps. These weren't stylized or symbolic depictions. They were graphic, unapologetically realistic, and often portrayed in a series like instructional panels. One cup might show a couple in one position. Another cup on the same table would show the next. A dinner guest passing a jug of wine might suddenly come face to face with a pair of entangled bodies frozen in mid-act. It was casual, it was normal, and it was very Roman. Artisans didn't seem to consider any act too private for public display. Heterosexual, homosexual, group activity, even the inclusion of mythological creatures or exaggerated anatomy, nothing was off limits. These were not shocking to the average Roman diner. On the contrary, such images were a mark of sophistication, wit, and even cultural awareness. They suggested that the host was worldly, educated, and unafraid to enjoy life in all its forms. Only in Rome could you eat olives out of a bowl decorated like an orgy and call it good taste. It wasn't satire. It wasn't pornography in the way modern minds might frame it. To the Romans, it was simply part of the texture of life. Beauty and pleasure weren't separate domains. They could overlap on a wine pitcher without anyone blinking. Many surviving pieces come from places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, where ash preserved even the most delicate designs. In some households, dining sets were clearly chosen to match the theme of leisure and indulgence. A host could set a table with all items showing different acts, like a tour of human passion rendered in clay. Some plates were divided into segments, each featuring a unique pose, suggesting not only visual appeal but also a hint of instructional use. These items were not necessarily reserved for brothels or wild parties. They showed up in private homes, bathhouses, and sometimes even in inns. It wasn't about arousing guests so much as setting an atmosphere. The Romans liked to mix conversation with philosophy, drink with poetry, and sex with art. The boundaries were deliberately blurred. What modern minds might consider crass or inappropriate, Roman hosts saw as refined and cultured. If a modern dinner party featured similar tableware, it would likely go viral, and not for its historical accuracy. Today's society often draws sharp lines between the erotic and the artistic. Rome had no such lines, or if it did, they were easily crossed with a laugh and another cup of wine. It speaks to a fundamental difference in how they viewed the body, pleasure, and the role of visual culture in everyday life. It wasn't just pottery. Erotic scenes were carved into furniture, etched into wall frescoes, and even included in mosaic floors. Some bedrooms had walls covered in sequences of acts, almost like storyboards. Public baths had changing rooms with tile work featuring couples in graphic poses. Even oil lamps, objects associated with quiet domestic moments, might feature lovers mid-embrace as their design. In other words, intimacy was never meant to be hidden. It was part of the aesthetic fabric of the home. Many of these artifacts show a remarkable attention to physical detail. Muscles, curves, and facial expressions, all rendered with a level of anatomical precision that suggests familiarity and comfort with the human body. Some pieces border on the humorous, with exaggerated features or playful compositions. Others are straightforward, showing pleasure without metaphor. It was not shameful, it was life. You start to realize that for the Romans, eroticism was not a private indulgence but a public language. Just like poetry or dance, it could be discussed, displayed, and appreciated in many forms. There was no sharp moral line, only context. A nude statue in a temple could coexist with a raunchy goblet in the kitchen. Both were valid expressions of human experience. This cultural openness didn't mean everyone was equally free to express themselves. As always, class and gender dictated who created the art, who purchased it, and how it was interpreted. Most artisans were lower-class workers producing for the wealthy elite. The images catered to elite tastes, often reinforcing the same power dynamics that played out in real bedrooms. Male dominance, female availability, and the casual objectification of enslaved bodies were common themes. Still, there was nuance. Some pieces subtly reversed roles, with women taking the lead or male figures shown in more vulnerable positions. These weren't acts of rebellion, but reflections of Rome's complex sexual imagination. Power could be performed in many ways, and sometimes even the suggestion of reversal was a form of erotic thrill. Today, museums often have to decide how much of this material to show. Some items remain locked in private collections or restricted rooms. Others are placed behind frosted glass with warning labels. But in ancient Rome, no such filters existed. A child could grow up seeing these images every day, learning about life and pleasure not from abstract stories, but from the dinner plates themselves. In this way, Rome's obsession with erotic art was never just about arousal. It was about creating an atmosphere, one where pleasure, beauty, and humor were allowed to coexist, one where the body wasn't just a subject of desire but of craftsmanship. Even today, the surviving pottery pieces still tell stories that speak not only to Roman desire, but to their belief that sex belonged at the table alongside wine, conversation, and laughter. Next, we turn to a more unsettling use of bodies in the Roman world where desire, violence, and faith collided under the name of punishment. Some Roman masters didn't just see their slaves as tools for labor or bodies for pleasure. For some, the use of a slave only ended when the slave did. After a night of entertainment, certain elites treated their captives not as people, but as objects with an expiration date. These weren't rare stories whispered in alleys. They were patterns, repeated and recorded by those bold enough to write them down. Some texts describe noblemen who used their sexual slaves for a single night, only to discard them the next morning like spoiled food. The disposal wasn't quiet or hidden. Bodies were sometimes dumped on the side of the road, left to rot in the sun without burial, without a name, without a second thought. The Roman legal system did not consider this murder. Slaves were property. If you broke a chair, no one called it a crime. The same logic applies to human beings. A man could beat, starve, or even kill his slave without punishment, so long as the act did not disturb public order. That was the line. Not morality, not compassion, just visibility. If no one complained, the law stayed silent. It's disturbing to realize that in some Roman households, what followed a night of sex wasn't sleep but execution. It was not always about rage or jealousy. Sometimes it was a ritual, the idea that power reached its peak only when it ended in destruction. To dominate someone so fully that you decided not only how they lived, but whether they continued to exist. That was the fantasy for certain Roman elites. The act of discarding a used slave became a final stamp of dominance, a way to show the household, the neighbors, and sometimes even guests that this man held absolute power over another life. This behavior wasn't a secret. Writers like Juvenal and Seneca mentioned such excesses. Satirists mocked them. Philosophers condemned them. But the practice persisted. The spectacle of cruelty became part of the social theatre. Guests might laugh or look away, but they rarely intervened. In some cases, these deaths happened as part of larger events, orgies that ended in violence, where laughter turned into screams, and no one left the room clean. Slaves had no protection. A female slave might be passed from one man to another during a banquet, then strangled by the last because she had displeased him. A male concubine might be killed for being too quiet, too loud, or simply no longer amusing. These were not crimes. They were personal decisions made in private homes that no court bothered to question. In modern terms, it's like throwing away a human being because the wine wasn't sweet enough, and the comparison isn't exaggerated. Some masters did kill for trivial reasons. A wrinkle in a sheet, a bite mark, a refusal to smile. When a slave was valued only for temporary pleasure, There was no room for mercy. What made it worse was the spectacle that often followed. Bodies were sometimes placed at crossroads or near fountains, where others could see and be reminded. It wasn't just disposal, it was a message. Power, after all, only means something if others witness it. Leaving the corpse out in public wasn't just negligence. It was part of the domination. A show of authority so twisted that even the aftermath became part of the performance. Slaves could not refuse sex, but they also could not refuse death. That dual trap made their situation especially cruel. Even those who pleased their masters lived under constant threat. The good night didn't guarantee a morning. Some were kept alive only because their master had not yet tired of them. Others were rewarded with better food or softer bedding, only to be killed when they asked for more. The inconsistency was part of the terror. There were no rules, only whims. The more you read about these practices, the more you realized that Roman power was obsessed with spectacle, even in its darkest forms. It wasn't enough to dominate. They needed to display the result, and the sexual domain was where this obsession played out with the fewest restrictions. The body of a slave was the blank canvas for a master's appetite, and when the art was done, the canvas was burned. This culture of post-use cruelty didn't extend to every household. There were masters who treated their slaves with some degree of decency, but among the powerful, among those who could get away with more, excess was often the point. The greater the display of disregard for life, the more untouchable a man appeared. It was a brutal equation, but it worked in a society where perception shaped reputation more than justice did. The city itself mirrored this contradiction. Rome, with its grand temples and public forums, also held alleys that stank of rotting flesh. People might pass by a discarded body and simply cover their nose. A slave's death didn't provoke mourning, it provoked shrugs. The body of a prostitute slave, doubly devalued, drew even less attention. Their lives ended in silence. Their names are lost. Their suffering was absorbed into the dust of the empire. There were no tombstones, no funerals, no elegies, just a body and a stain. Sometimes not even that. Animals might drag the corpse away before morning. Children might poke it with sticks. The world moved on. The master might host another dinner that night. A new slave might be brought in, wide-eyed and unaware of what had happened to the one who came before. It's hard not to feel that behind the glory of Rome. Beneath the marble and the rhetoric, there was a hunger that consumed without remorse. And the people it consumed most easily were the ones least able to speak. They were the ones who never had a choice, who were used, discarded, and forgotten. In the next part, we'll step into the final chapter of Roman sexual cruelty, where the body became more than a plaything. It became a weapon, a message, a punishment, and in the end, a political tool. The evidence of Rome's obsession with sex did not vanish with the fall of the empire. Much of it survived, embedded in walls, carved into furniture, painted across pottery, and preserved under layers of ash. Pompeii and Herculaneum are often treated as archaeological wonders, but what they truly preserve is the bluntness of Roman desire. When the ash of Mount Vesuvius froze life in place, it also froze the casual acceptance of erotic art. In homes, inns, and even bakeries, archaeologists uncovered mosaics showing acts so explicit that museums have debated for years how to display them. Some frescoes were so bold that they were locked away in so-called secret rooms for decades, hidden from the public and only accessible to scholars. The ancient Romans had placed these same images above their beds, beside their bathtubs, and over their dining tables. To them, sex was not an act to be whispered about. It was a part of a life's rhythm, a theme suitable for everyday decor. Their open portrayal was not just an artistic choice. It reflected a culture where sexuality was a social performance, a religious act, and a political tool all at once. These attitudes did not disappear with time. Instead, they echoed quietly through history, resurfacing in curious places. During the Renaissance, when Europe claimed to rediscover classical values, Many artists and thinkers looked to Rome for inspiration, and what they found was not just law, architecture, or philosophy. They also found the permissiveness of Roman eroticism. Renaissance nobles collected Roman sex art. Writers translated and reinterpreted ancient erotic poems. Even the idea of using the body to communicate status and desire found new life in paintings and sculptures. It's a little ironic that the same culture that inspired grand cathedrals also inspired manuals on how to flirt like a Roman. In more subtle ways, modern sexuality has inherited Rome's complicated view of dominance, shame, and image. Today's obsession with reputation, with the curated self, isn't that different from Roman ideals. Back then, a man's sexual conduct was tied to his identity in public life. Today, a single scandal can still undo a career. The stakes remain high, only the settings have changed. We no longer carve our reputations into stone, but we scroll past them on screens. Even the more niche sexual practices of Rome have left their traces. Bondage, role-play, and exhibitionism all have echoes in ancient Roman rituals, performances, and private lives. Some of the more elaborate Roman sex manuals gave detailed advice on posture, technique, and atmosphere. They offered tips for lasting longer, impressing one's lover, and even pleasing multiple partners at once. If that sounds like a modern lifestyle magazine, it's because much of what we think of as new is just Rome showing up in different clothes. The most striking inheritance, however, is not in technique but in mindset. Rome taught the world that sex can be a hierarchy. It can be used to define who is in power and who is beneath. That legacy is harder to shake. It lingers in attitude about masculinity, in laws that still police certain bodies more than others, and in the idea that pleasure needs justification. Roman men believed they had the right to take what they wanted, provided the partner had less status. That calculation of power has resurfaced across centuries, often dressed up as tradition or morality. Of course, history also twists what it remembers. The Roman Empire was not a single-minded orgy. It had variation, contradiction, and change. Some emperors tried to promote stricter sexual behavior. Others leaned into public decadence. Some citizens resisted the open sexuality around them. Others participated in it quietly, behind closed doors. What we know comes mostly from elite voices, poets, historians, sculptors. We don't hear much from the slaves, prostitutes, or ordinary people whose bodies were used to build Rome's erotic image. But what we do have, the ruins, the artifacts, the records, shows us a culture both proud and paranoid. The Romans celebrated their appetite, but they were also terrified of losing control. That's why they wrote laws to enforce gender roles. That's why they performed masculinity so loudly. That's why they turned sex into politics, into gossip, into theatre. For them, sex was never just about pleasure. It was a currency, and like all currencies, it had winners and losers. It's wild to think that the same empire that built aqueducts and roads also built brothels on every corner. They saw no contradiction in this. Engineering and indulgence, discipline and desire, went hand in hand. Their temples had both altars and phallic charms. Their military generals quoted poetry about love. Their household gods stood beside erotic statuettes. Rome was a place where sex was not compartmentalized. It bled into every corner of life. Reading about it now, one thing becomes clear. Empires don't just fall because of enemies at the gate. Sometimes they collapse under the weight of their own excess. That doesn't mean Roman sexuality caused the empire's decline, but it certainly reveals the culture's blind spots. The same arrogance that claimed lands and crushed rebellions also assumed the body could be used without consequence, that no pleasure was too costly, and no act too indulgent, so long as it affirmed power. Today, tourists walk through Pompeii and Herculaneum in quiet awe, reading plaques beside crumbling beds and faded paintings. Children avert their eyes from certain murals. Some visitors laugh nervously. Others snap photos of ceramic penises on kitchen walls. But none of them can deny the bluntness of what the Romans left behind. They didn't whisper their desires, they carved them into stone. The sexual history of Rome is not just about shock value, it's about how humans have always wrestled with power, image, control, and shame. The ancient Romans were not more perverse than we are. They were just more open about what they believed sex could do. That openness makes us uncomfortable, and perhaps it should, because buried beneath the ashen stone is a mirror, and sometimes, when we stare into it, we see more of ourselves than we expect. So, as we wrap up this journey through the strangest corners of Roman sexuality, take a moment to reflect, not just on what they did, but on how much of it still shapes the way we think about the body, pleasure, and power. Good night, friend. May your sleep be peaceful, and your dreams free of Roman bathhouses.